Hey, Ninja. Hey, Ninja. Welcome. You are the first one here, yeah. God, it is hot outside today. It's like 79 in my room right now. I do not like hot weather. Well, yesterday, if you missed it, uh, we killed Spazmatism. We took him from like 12,000 HP or whatever he was at down to 0. Retinazer is still in his first phase though. 13,299 HP. I believe he hits phase 2 at about 1,200, so we've still got a decent while to go. I'm just going to sit still and AFK for a little bit, probably keep reading at the Mountains of Madness for a bit. And then once he hits second phase, we'll start to reconsider. So for the meantime, I'll get back to story time. There's the... Oh no, the song! Hold on. In world, it was called like Lost City. Yeah. It's easy, YY. Okay. So we just hit chapter 7. About the Mountains of Madness. Okay. Let me know if the volume of the music is a bit loud in comparison to my voice. And I'm also going to go ahead and rebind both of these to mouse 5 so I can tape it down easily. It feels like it might be a little loud. Let me turn that down a bit. Maybe something more like that. Ambient noise, not direct sound itself. Okay. And our best way to deal damage to a Retinazer here is really just to tank his hits. And whenever he rams into us, we happen to hit him. There's not really a good way for me to teleport to his current location. I don't have teleporters set up to go diagonally like that. But we'll deal damage like that. Oh, you know what? I should equip a shark tooth necklace. Do this really quick. Hey, Adam. Not too much as of right now. Just back to fighting Retinazer. Hold on. I ripped my tape on accident. I gotta get more. Maybe not. Hold on. Are we reading more today? But right now, yeah. We'll have to see if I'll manage to read during, Retinazer's second phase. I'm not too sure that's going to go very well. We'll see. It's not going to be too much longer till we hit Retinazer phase 2, though. Let me go ahead and exit out of here. That's what I want to click. Tape down that button. Okay. So this is At the Mountains of Madness, Chapter 7. Just after Danforth and the narrator had spent a fair amount of time flying around and delving into the city. At the peak of the plateau in the Mountains of Madness. Naturally, Danforth and I studied with a special interest and peculiarly personal sense of awe everything pertaining to the immediate district in which we were. Of this local material, there was naturally a vast abundance, and on the tangled ground level of the city, we were lucky enough to find a house of very late date, whose walls, though somewhat damaged by a neighboring rift, contained sculptures of decadent workmanship carrying the story of the region much beyond the period of the Pliocene map, whence we derived our last general glimpse of the pre-human world. This was the last place we examined in detail, since what we found here gave us a fresh, immediate objective. Why isn't he in second phase? Because we haven't done enough damage to him to get to his second phase? I don't understand the question. Certainly, we were in one of the strangest, weirdest, and most terrible of all the corners of Earth's globe. Of all existing lands, it was infinitely the most ancient, and the conviction grew upon us that this hideous upland must indeed be the fabled nightmare plateau of Leng, which even the mad author of the Necronomicon was reluctant to discuss. The great mountain chain was tremendously long, starting as a low range at Luitpold Land on the coast of Weddell Sea and virtually crossing the entire continent. The really high part stretched in a mighty arc from about latitude 82 degrees east latitude 60 degrees to latitude 70 degrees east latitude 115 degrees, with its concave side toward our camp and its seaward end in the region of that long, ice-locked coast whose hills were glimpsed by Wilkes and Mawson at the Antarctic Circle. Yeah, we've been reading at the Mountains of Madness, Kanata. Over the course of the Twins fight, we're currently, I think we only have like 30 or so pages left. Let me check. We're on page 834. We go to page 865. So about 31 pages left. We've gone through about 60 pages? Yet even more monstrous exaggerations of nature seem disturbingly close at hand. I have said that these peaks are higher than the Himalayas, but the sculptures forbid me to say that they are the Earth's highest. That grim honor is beyond all doubt reserved for something which half the sculptures hesitated to record at all, whilst others approached it with obvious repugnance and trepidation. Let me hold my mic more intimately. Let me know, by the way, if my mic volume is... I'll turn it down a bit, because I'm getting a bit closer to my mic now. How are we doing on Retinazer health? That grim honor is beyond doubt reserved for something which half the sculptors hesitated to record at all, whilst others approached it with obvious repugnance and trepidation. It seems that there was one pout of the ancient land, the first pout that ever rose from the waters after the earth had flung off the moon and the old one that seeped down from the stars, which had come to be shunned as a vaguely and namelessly evil. Cities built there had crumbled before their time and had been found suddenly deserted. Then, when the first great earth buckling had convulsed the region in the Comanchean age, a frightful line of peaks had shot suddenly up amidst the most appalling din and chaos, and earth had received her loftiest and most terrible mountains. If the scale of the carvings was correct, these abhorred things must have been over 40,000 feet high, radically vaster than even the shocking mountains of madness we had crossed. They extended, it appeared, from about latitude 77 degrees east latitude 70 degrees to latitude 70 degrees east longitude 100 degrees. East longitude 70 degrees. Let me just reread that. They extended, it appeared, from about latitude 77 degrees east longitude 70 degrees to latitude 70 degrees east longitude 100 degrees, less than 300 miles away from the dead city, so that we would have spied their dreaded summits in the dim western distance had it not been for that vague, opalescent haze. Their northern end must likewise be visible from the long Antarctic Circle coastline at Queen Maryland. Some of the old ones, in the decadent days, had made strange prayers to those mountains, but none ever went near them or dared to guess what lay beyond. No human eye had ever seen them, and as I studied the emotions conveyed in the carvings, I prayed that none ever might. There are protecting hills along the coast beyond them, Queen Mary and Kaiser Wilhelm lands, and I thank heaven no one has been able to land and climb those hills. I am not as skeptical about old tales and fears as I used to be, and I do not laugh now that pre-human sculptors... Let me reread that. God, these sentences are a mouthful. I am not as skeptical about old tales and fears as I used to be, and I do not now laugh at the pre-human sculptor's notion that lightning paused meaningfully now and then at each of the brooding crests, and that an unexplained glow shone from one of those very terrible pinnacles all through the long polar night. There may be a very real and very monstrous meaning in the old narcotic whispers about Kadath and the cold waste. But the terrain close at hand was hardly less strange, even if less namelessly accursed. Soon after the founding of the city, the great mountain range became the seat of the principal temples, and many carvings shewed what grotesque and fantastic towers had pierced the sky where now we saw only the curiously clinging cubes and ramparts. In the course of ages, the caves had appeared and had been shaped into In the course of ages, the caves had appeared and had been shaped into adjuncts of the temples. With the advance of still later epochs, all the limestone veins of the region were hollowed out by the groundwaters, so that the mountains, the foothills, and the plains below them were a veritable network of connected caverns and galleries. Many graphic sculptures told of explorations deep underground, and of the final discovery of the Stygian sunless sea that looked at Earth's bowels. Yeah, no, if we're done too soon, can you read Shadow at a Time or Whisper in the Darkness? I'm not even sure we're going to be able to finish at the Mountains of Madness. I can only really do it when we're AFK, and I don't know if we'll be able to AFK Retinazer second phase very well. We'll have to see how it goes. But we're going to have plenty of other boss fights, Kanata. Plenty of other opportunities to read. Particularly Golem and Plantera. Health Plant Phase 2? Figure it out. This vast, nighted gulf had undoubtedly been worn by the great river which flowed down from the nameless and horrible westward mountains, and which had formerly turned at the base of the Old One's range and flowed beside that chain into the Indian Ocean between Bud and Totten lands on Wilkes coastline. Little by little, it had eaten away at the limestone hill base at its turning, till at last its sapping currents reached the caverns of the groundwaters and joined with them in digging a deeper abyss. Finally, its whole bulk emptied into the hollow hills and left the old bed toward the ocean dry. Much of the later city as we now found it had been built over that former bed. The old ones, understanding what had happened and exercising their always keen artistic sense, had carved into ornate pylons those headlands of the foothills where the great stream began its descent into eternal darkness. This river, once crossed by scores of noble stone bridges, was plainly the one whose extinct course we had seen in our aeroplane survey. Its position in different carvings of the city helped us to orient ourselves to the scene as it had been at various stages of the region's age-long, eon-dead history. Its position in different carvings of the city helped us to orient ourselves to the scene as it had been at various stages of the region's age-long, eon-dead history, so that we were able to sketch a hasty but careful map of the salient features, squares, important buildings, and the like, for guidance in further explorations. We could soon reconstruct and fancy the whole stupendous thing as it was 1 million or 10 million or 50 million years ago, where the sculptures told us exactly what the buildings and mountains and squares and suburbs and landscape setting and luxury... Holy shit, have you ever heard of a run-on sentence, man? What the fuck? We could soon reconstruct and fancy the whole stupendous thing as it was 1 million or 10 million or 50 million years ago, for the sculptures told us exactly what the buildings and mountains and squares and suburbs and landscape setting and luxuriant tertiary vegetation had looked like. That was all one sentence. Hey, Time Death. It must have been a marvelous and mystic beauty. And as I thought of it, I almost forgot the clammy sense of sinister oppression from which the city's inhuman age and massiveness and deadness and remoteness and glacial twilight had choked and weighed on my spirit. Yet according to certain carvings, the denizens of that city had themselves known the clutch of oppressive terror, for there was a somber and recurrent type of scene in which the old ones were shewn in the act of recoiling affrightedly from some object, never allowed to appear in the design, found in the great river and indicated as having been washed down through waving, vine-draped cycad forests from those horrible westward mountains. So at this point, the narrator is starting to describe that the old ones themselves... I'm streaming each twin separately? Well, I mean, I finished spazmatism yesterday. The first 2 days were dedicated to killing spazmatism. We just damaged Retinazer, incidentally. Now we have to kill Retinazer. In the course of exploring the dead city at the Mountains of Madness, the narrator uncovered the fact that the old ones themselves, the eldritch beings from beyond the stars who had created humanity in its current form, before leaving it to evolve freely, rather than live as livestock, were themselves afraid of something more within the Mountains of Madness, off west within the large mountains. Retinazer is now in Phase 2. And so, the time of reading is going to stop here. Good luck with Mechdusa if we're going to fight it. No, we're not going to fight Mechdusa. Let's see how this goes. So as you can plainly tell here, Retinazer in his second phase no longer dashes at you. It is not possible to have him intentionally come within distance of you. You have to move to him. So, let's get to experimenting. Hi, Pink Mimic. I can't hit him. I can't... He's literally standing on top of a teleporter that I set up to be able to hit him. I don't know what you're talking about. I can't hit him? I just hit him. What do you mean I can't hit him? He's literally standing on top of the thing that I set up to hit him. What do you mean I can't hit him? I'm hitting him right now. Unfortunately, honestly, I think we mostly AFK this fight because, like, there's really very little interactiveness here. Because all that I'm going to do is just press a button to teleport when he focuses, hit him a couple times, and then teleport back. It's not really much for me to do, because even if I put more teleports vertically, I have to wait for him to, like, stabilize. Because if I teleport now, we can't really hit him. We have to wait for him to stabilize. And he keeps going to the left side where I don't have a teleporter set up. So yeah, this will be slow. So I think we go back to reading. I'm going to go ahead and tape these down again. I'm going to rebind left click to something I can just press easily. How do you plan to beat Moonlord? He has regen, you need to a minimum damage amount. That is not true, Amelia. I would point you to the times that I have killed the Moonlord with a flare gun, or a copper short sword, or bouncy dynamite, or a phoenix blaster, or a wooden bow, or really any number of low damage weapons, and use those as a reference for the fact that the Moonlord's healing mechanic is entirely avoidable and is not nearly as problematic as people make it out to be. Yes, the Moonlord's healing mechanic is based on the Moonbite debuff that he inflicts with his tongue. It is completely avoidable and not terribly difficult to avoid if you know what you're doing. If you think the Moonlord is not possible due to the existence of his healing mechanic, I think you have probably been influenced by people that are mistaken about the fight and believe the mechanic to be unavoidable, and therefore making low damage things impossible. It is completely avoidable, and a lot of people have misinformation regarding the mechanics of the fight. It is not nearly as difficult as people make it out to be to avoid him from healing. But, let's get back to reading. I'm also, like I said, I'm going to rebind... Wouldn't it be impossible because his hitboxes are in the air? Retinazer's hitbox is currently in the air and we can hit him. We just have to position ourselves in a particular way to be able to hit him. He's not locked in position to you. You can, like, his hitbox can be on the ground if you're on the ground. You know where he's going to be. He stays in a position that's consistent around you. It wouldn't be easy to set up, but, oh, dying's not an issue, crap. That's not a problem at all. I'm not remotely concerned about dying during the Moonlord. Let me put teleport on here. I would suggest, Romelia, that you watch the videos I made. I think Bouncy Dynamite only. I explained it a lot. Went into a lot of detail there. It's going to be difficult for me to describe the exact mechanics of the Moonlord fight in a way that's going to be coherent for you to understand when I'm not fighting him, and I feel like watching me do it as I've explained it in the past, where I'm showing things as they're happening, is going to make it easier to understand. But the gist of it is that his tongue flies at about 82 miles per hour. If you avoid his tongue altogether, he will never inflict you with the Moonbite debuff, and as a result, you will never be in the required circumstance for him to heal, and even if he does hit you with the Moonbite debuff, you can still avoid it with clever use of teleporting. It's really not nearly as much of a problem as people make it out to be, and there's a lot of people that misunderstand the mechanics of that fight and think it to be impossible. And I think that's just because for a long period of time, people thought the healing mechanic was unavoidable, or you needed to use the nose for it, which is kind of silly, because you do not need to use the nose for that. Do I have Smart Cursor turned on right now? Okay. Wait, what if I... Hold on. Okay. Alright. I'm down. If I just spam teleporting, he doesn't move to adjust. So we can deal more damage more quickly that way. I think that's going to be the go-to strat. Because we get in like 2 or 3 times as much damage by doing this. Can you hear me tapping my key? Is me tapping the down key too loud? Because I could rebind it to something else. Because I don't want it to interrupt me while I'm reading. No? Okay, good. A lot more than 2 to 3 times. It's tough for me to tell. Can't hear the keys? Okay, good. He's 11,902. We did about 8 damage there, and that was not an ideal circumstance. So it looks like we do about 8 to 9 damage per teleport. As opposed to if we do it normally, it's like 3 damage. So yeah, we do like 3 times as much damage by spamming teleports because he's not able to adjust. Okay, that's going to help out a lot. That's going to... Big DPS increase. Okay, well, the issue is... I have to... Like, if I want to read while I'm doing this, I don't really need to look at the screen that much, but I need to make sure that I'm... staying below, not above. Because otherwise he's going to center above me. So we'll have to look at some points. My fingers might also get tired at some point from tapping so much. Wait, what if I were to... Do I have a timer? What if I were to just wire up a quarter-second time? Well, I don't know if quarter-second's fast enough. Put a PDF of the Mountains of Madness on my second monitor. Problem is I'm reading it in person. I get lost in a PDF too easily. It's fine. Okay, It was only in the one late-built house with the decadent carvings that we obtained any foreshadowing of the final calamity leading to the city's desertion. Calamity mod? Terraria? Holy shit. It was only in one late-built house with the decadent carvings that we obtained any foreshadowing of the final calamity leading to the city's desertion. Undoubtedly, there must have been many sculptures in the same age elsewhere, even allowing for the slackened energies and aspirations of a stressful and uncertain period. Indeed, very certain evidence of the existence of others came to us shortly afterward. What? I need to reread that sentence. I didn't post that. Undoubtedly, there must have been many sculptures of the same age elsewhere, even allowing for the slackened energies and aspirations of a stressful and uncertain period. Indeed, very certain evidence of the existence of others came to us shortly afterward. Okay, so even in the really stressed, about to be deserted age of this city, they still afforded the time to create these artistic sculptures and depictions, I think is what he's saying. But this was the first and only we directly encountered. We meant to look farther later on, as I have said. But as I have said, immediate conditions dictated another present objective. There would, though, have been a limit. For after all hope of a long future occupancy of the place had perished among the old ones, there could not but have been a complete cessation of... But this was the first and only we directly encountered. We meant to look farther later on, but as I have said, immediate conditions dictated another present objective. There would, though, have been a limit. For after all hope of a long future occupancy of the place had perished among the old ones, there could not but have been a complete cessation of mural decoration. So he's saying that after the old ones realized they were unable to inhabit this city any longer, they stopped decorating the place with murals detailing their history. The ultimate blow, of course, was the coming of a great cold which once held most of Earth in thrall, and which has never departed from the ill-fated poles. The great cold that, at the world's other extremity, put an end to the fabled lands of Lawnmower and Hyperborea. Just when this tendency began in the Antarctic, it would be hard to say in terms of exact years. Nowadays, we set the beginning of the general glacial periods at a distance of about 500,000 years from the present, but at the poles the terrible scourge must have commenced much earlier. All quantitative estimates are partly guesswork, but it is quite likely that the decadent sculptures were made considerably less than 1 million years ago, and the actual desertion of the city was complete long before the conventional opening of the Pleistocene. 500,000 years ago is reckoned in terms of the Earth's whole surface. Let me reread that. My reading ability is diminished slightly because I have to keep watching back on Retinazer. This is actually going relatively quickly. We've already dealt almost 400 damage to phase 2. Which is... He only has 12,000 HP. We're probably like 3% of the way done for the day, yeah? This is a good example, though, of... We'll figure out how to do it when we get there. Like, so many people just lack confidence in my ability to come up with strategies to do things, and have... There's not a single boss in the game that I think would be impossible to damage with the Lawnmower. I haven't figured out the strategy for how to do it yet. Like, I didn't know I was gonna spam teleports on top of Retinazer, and that would lock his AI in this way. Let's see, how long have we been streaming Retinazer's second phase for? How long has it been? Like 10 minutes? When did we start phase 2? Based on that, we can estimate how long it'll take in total. I feel like it's been around 10 minutes. Not long. I'm gonna guess 500 damage every 10 minutes as our estimate. How long does that cycle of teleport hit? I do not know the exact timing of Retinazer's attacks. We could figure it out. We have a watch. We'll just look over now. 15, 16, 17. Looks like about 5 seconds. Looks like he has about 5 seconds of hovering above you, and then about 3 seconds of horizontal. However, his cycles, he shoots for longer periods as he gets more damaged. Like, he spends more time horizontal to the lower he gets in HP. A little over 10 minutes. Let's say 500 damage every 10 minutes. Because it also took us a while to come up with a strategy. That would be... What, 3,000 damage an hour? Is teleporting slower? No, teleporting slower. Actually... Yeah, if we... There's a balance. We need to teleport... I'm not sure if that's actually changing my damage that much. Maybe it's slightly more efficient. We're still in like the 3 to 4 DPS range. It's tough to say for me. Yeah, it'd be about 4 hours, I think. If we do 500 damage every 10 minutes. Which is, not that. That's quicker than spazmatism was, at least. And we may be doing more damage than that. It's entirely possible. Issue is I only really get like a couple seconds to look away at a time to read. In the decadent sculptures, there were signs of thinner vegetation everywhere, and of a decreased country life on the part of the old ones. Heating devices were shewn in the houses. This is speaking of when the abandoning of the city began. It's sea shark tails. So the old ones, at the time of abandoning the city, this is the way that they had been living. In the decadent sculptures, there were signs of thinner vegetation everywhere, and of a decreased country life on the part of the old ones. Heating devices were shewn in the houses, and winter travelers were represented in... Heating devices were shown in the houses, and winter travelers were represented as muffled in protective fabrics. Then we saw a series of cartouches, the continuous band arrangements being frequently interrupted in these late carvings. depicting a constantly growing migration to the nearest refuges of greater warmth, some fleeing to cities under the sea of a faraway coast, some clambering through networks of limestone caverns in the hollow hills to the neighboring black abyss of subterranean waters. In the end, it seems to have been the neighboring abyss which received the greatest colonization. This was partly due, no doubt, to the traditional sacredness of this special region, but may have been more conclusively determined by the opportunities it gave for continuing the use of the great temples on the honeycombed mountains, and for retaining the vast land city as a place of summer residence and base of communication in various mines. The linkage of old and new abodes was made more effective by means of several gratings and improvements along the connecting routes, including the chiseling of numerous direct tunnels from the ancient metropolis to the Black Abyss, sharply down-pointing tunnels whose mouths we carefully drew, according to our most thoughtful estimates, on the guide map we were compiling. So essentially, as the old ones were abandoning the city, they moved out of the city, and the river that the narrator had mentioned earlier as running alongside the city gradually wore down the limestone and rock and went down into a large abyss in limestone caverns beneath the city, and many of them migrated to there instead of back out to the sea, to be able to have some usage of the city in times of summer when the warmth returned a bit, and to be able to use the objects of religious significance there, as he suspects, the temples and whatnot. It was obvious that at least 2 of these tunnels lay within a reasonable exploring distance of where we were, both being on the mountainward edge of the city, one less than a quarter mile toward the ancient river course, and the other perhaps twice that distance in the opposite direction. The abyss, it seems, had shelving shores of dry land at certain places, but the old ones built their new city underwater, no doubt because of its greater certainty of uniform warmth. The depth of the hidden sea appears to have been very great, so that the Earth's internal heat could ensure its habitability for an indefinite period. The beings seem to have had no trouble in adapting themselves to part-time and eventually whole-time residence underwater, since they had never allowed their gill systems to atrophy. There were many sculptures which shewed how they had always frequently... Shewed, I guess, is just an antiquated word for shown, and he uses it a lot, and it trips me up every time. But whenever he says shewed, he's meaning shown. I'm fairly sure. Yeah, honestly, the twins have not been as bad as I was initially expecting they might have been. I was expecting to be here for much longer for Retinazer's Phase 2. The stream is starting to overpass your time to watch it. That's alright. You don't have any obligation to be here if you have other stuff you need to do. Don't worry about it. Hey, Sir Pootsman. It's not easy reading this while simultaneously fighting Retinazer here. This is a lot more active than spazmatism was. It's not dangerous at all, but it is slightly active. There were many sculptures which shewed how they had always frequently visited their submarine kinsfolk elsewhere, and how they had habitually bathed on the deep bottom of, page turn, the great river. The darkness of inner Earth could likewise have been no deterrent to a race accustomed to long Antarctic nights. What are we reading? At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. At the point, as a story summary, several professors from Miskatonic University had ventured to the Antarctic using with the intention of trying to gain more understanding of what life in the Antarctic was like before it had been frozen over in the last ice age. And the expedition had originally split into 2 parties, one going forward with most of the supplies and planes to a phenomenal mountain range, much higher than anything else they had seen in the world elsewhere or heard of. That exploring party had met a rather unfortunate fate fate, as they had uncovered ancient life within limestone caverns beneath the surface. Life unlike anything else they had seen on Earth before. It seemed partly vegetable and partly creature, and it seemed to predate what they understood life to be on the planet. And it seems that the life they had uncovered was not truly dead, but merely dormant. And in a coming storm, it had slaughtered that party, kidnapped one dog and one human, and the rest of the party came to find their remains in various gruesome states of death. Following that, the narrator and one student, Danforth, had ventured out on an airplane to try to get a greater survey of the land. They had uncovered a massive city amidst the mountains of madness on a plateau above it, and have been exploring inside of it. And through this exploration, they've gotten a better understanding of the creatures that their ill-fated companions had uncovered from beneath the surface. They were a species of travelers from outer space, known to the narrator as the Old Ones. And these creatures had essentially created life on Earth, as it were, mostly for the sake of either enslavement or a food source. But over time, with the freezing of the region and the size of the Earth, life began to grow outside of their sphere of influence, and the Old Ones themselves had retreated from this city and were still learning what exactly happened to them. And he's uncovering this story through murals and sculptures left behind in the hundreds of thousands of years abandoned city. Decadent though their style undoubtedly was, these latest carvings had a truly epic quality, where they told of a building of the new city in the Cavern Sea. The Old Ones had gone about it scientifically, quarrying insoluble rocks from the heart of the honeycombed mountains, and employing expert workers from the nearest submarine city to perform the construction according to the best methods. These workers brought with them all that was necessary to establish the new venture: Shoggoth tissue from which to breed stone lifters and subsequent beasts of burdens for the Cavern City, and other protoplasmic matter to mold into phosphorescent organisms for lighting purposes. At last, a mighty metropolis rose on the bottom of that Stygian sea, its architecture much like that of the city above, and its workmanship displaying relatively little decadence because of the precise mathematical element inherent in building operations. The newly bred Shoggoths grew to enormous size and singular intelligence, and they were represented as taking and executing orders with marvelous quickness. They seemed to converse with the Old Ones by mimicking their voices, a sort of musical piping over a wide range, if poor Lake's dissection had indicated. Got it. They seemed to converse with the Old Ones by mimicking their voices, a sort of musical piping over a wide range, if poor Lake's dissection had indicated aright, and to work more from spoken commands than from hypnotic suggestions, as in earlier times. The Shoggoths were another species that the Old Ones had created, with the purpose of using them essentially as slave labor, controlling them hypnotically. They were formless, shapeless beings able to manipulate their bodies at will to whatever forms were desired, and they were used largely to carry, and the only real reason modern Legion deals damage, you can knock NPCs away when you're mowing. You know, we can ask the developers what they thought when they were making the Lawnmower. They were, however, kept in admirable control. The phosphorescent organisms supplied light with vast effectiveness and doubtless atoned for the loss of the familiar polar auroras of the outer world night. So at this point, the Old Ones have retreated into their city in a Stygian sea deep beneath the surface, being flowed to by that same river. And by all accounts recorded in the murals at this city, that city was built and executed with phenomenal skill. They had no issues with the enslaved Shoggoths being rebellious or out of control, The buildings were built to marvelous mathematical standards, and the light provided by phosphorescent organisms was exceedingly effective. Art and decoration were pursued, though of course with a certain decadence. The old ones seemed to realize this falling off themselves, and in many cases anticipated the policy of Constantine the Great by transplanting a special... Hold on. Art and decoration were pursued, though of course with a certain decadence. The old ones seemed to realize this falling off themselves, and in many cases anticipated the policy of Constantine the Great by transplanting especially fine blocks of ancient carving from their land city, just as the emperor, in a similar age of decline, stripped Greece and Asia of their finest art to give his new Byzantine capital greater splendors than its own people could create. Story reminds you of Ancients from Rainworld. A lot of writers that utilize elements of cosmic and eldritch horrors and beings are taking inspiration from Lovecraft. And Rainworld has a vibe that I could see as being inspired there, particularly in terms of scale. You sure Lovecraft didn't take inspiration from Rainworld? I'm not sure. No, nobody's asked him recently. But yes, the old ones took the artwork they had created in older times from their land city and brought it underground to display, which presumably is why a large amount of the artwork in that city is missing, as they seemed either less willing or incapable of creating it themselves down there. That the transfer of sculptured blocks had not been more extensive was doubtless owing to the fact that the land city was not at first wholly abandoned. By the time total abandonment did occur, and it surely must have occurred before the polar Pleistocene was far advanced, the old ones had perhaps become satisfied with their decadent art, or had ceased to recognize the superior merit of the older carvings. At any rate, the eon-silent ruins around us had certainly undergone no wholesale sculptural denunciation, though all the best separate statues, like other movables, had been taken away. The decadent cartouches and dadows telling the story were, as I said, the latest we could find in our limited search. They left us with a picture of the old ones shuttling back and forth betwixt the land city in summer and the sea cavern city in winter, and sometimes trading with the sea bottom cities off the Antarctic coast. By this time, the ultimate doom of the land city must have been recognized, for the sculptures shewed many signs of the cold's malign encroachments. The vegetation was declining, and the terrible snows of the winter no longer melted completely, even in midsummer. The saurian livestock were nearly all dead, and the mammals were standing it none too well. To keep on with the work of the upper world, it had become necessary to adapt some of the amorphous and curiously cold-resistant shoggoths to a land life, a thing the old ones had formerly been reluctant to do. The great river was now lifeless, and the upper sea had lost most of its denizens except for seals and whales. All the birds had flown away, save only the great, grotesque penguins. What had happened afterward, we could only guess. How long could the new sea cavern city have survived? Was it still down there, a stony corpse in eternal blackness? Had the subterranean waters frozen at last? To what fate had the ocean-bottom cities of the outer world been delivered? Had any of the old ones shifted north ahead of the creeping ice cap? Existing geology shews no trace of their presence. Had the frightful Migo been still a menace in the outer land world of the north? Let me get back on cycle with Retinazer. Could one be sure of what might or might not linger, even to this day, in the lightless and unplumed abysses of Earth's deepest waters? Those things had seemingly been able to withstand any amount of pressure, and men of the sea had fished up curious objects at times. And has the killer whale theory of the sea, has the killer whale theory really explained the savage and mysterious scars on Antarctic seals noticed a generation ago by Borchgrevink? What the fuck is that name? Borchgrevink? It's like a Russian name. Borchgrevink. Borchgrevink? And has... Let me just reread this whole paragraph. What had happened afterward, we could only guess. How long had the new sea cavern city survived? What had happened afterward, we could only guess. How long had the new sea cavern city survived? Was it still down there, a stony corpse in eternal blackness? Had the subterranean waters frozen at last? To what fate had the ocean-bottom cities of the outer world been delivered? Had any of the old ones shifted north ahead of the creeping ice cap? Existing geology shews no trace of their presence. Had the frightful Migo still been a menace in the outer land world of the north? Could one be sure of what might or might not linger even to this day in the lightless and unplumed depths of Earth's deepest abysses? Those things had seemingly been able to withstand any amount of pressure, and men of the sea had fished up curious objects at times. And has the killer whale theory really explained the savage and mysterious scars on Antarctic seals noticed a generation ago by Borchgrevink? The specimens found by Poor Lake did not enter into these guesses, for their geologic setting proved them to have lived at what must have been a very early date in the land city's history. They were, according to their location, certainly not less than 30 million years old. And we reflected that in the day of the sea cavern city, and indeed the cavern itself, had no existence. They would have remembered an older scene, with lush tertiary vegetation everywhere, a younger land city of flourishing outs around them, and a great river sweeping northward along the base of the mighty mountains toward a faraway tropic ocean. And yet, we could not help thinking about these specimens, especially about the 8 perfect ones that were missing from Lake's hideously ravaged camp. There was something abnormal about the whole business. The strange things we had tried so hard to lay to someone's madness, those frightful graves, the amount and nature of the missing material, Gedney, the unearthly toughness of those archaic monstrosities, and the queer vital freaks the sculptures now shewed the race to have. Danforth and I had seen a good deal in the last few hours, and were prepared to believe and keep silent about many appalling and incredible secrets of primal nature. Chapter 9. I have said that our study of the decadent sculptures brought about a change in our immediate objective. This, of course, had to do with the chiseled avenues to the black inner world, of whose existence we had not known before, but which we were now eager to find and traverse. From the evident scale of the carvings, we deduced that a steeply descending walk of about a mile through either of the neighboring tunnels would bring us to the brink of the dizzy, sunless cliffs above the great abyss, down whose side adequate paths, improved by the old ones, led to the rocky shore of the hidden and nighted ocean. To behold this fabulous gulf in stark reality was a lure which seemed impossible of resistance once we knew of the thing, yet we realized that we must begin the quest at once if we expected to include it on our present flight. It was now 8 p.m., and we had not enough battery replacements to let our torches... Hey, Jokey. It was now 8 p.m., and we had not enough battery replacements to let our torches burn on forever. We had done so much of our studying and copying below the glacial level that our battery supply had at least 5 hours of nearly continuous use. And despite the special dry cell formula would obviously be good for only about 4 more. Though by keeping one torch unused except for especially interesting or difficult places, we might manage to eke out a safe margin beyond that. It would not do to be without a light in these Cyclopean catacombs, hence, in order to make the Abyss trip, we must give up all further mural deciphering. Of course, we intended to revisit the place for days, and perhaps weeks of intensive study and photography, curiosity having long gotten the better of horror, but just now we must hasten. Our supply of trailblazing paper was far from unlimited, and we were reluctant to sacrifice spare notebooks, or sketching paper to augment it. I just need to reread this whole thing. My flow through the sentence has been awful as I've been looking away to look at Retinazer. It was now 8 p.m., and we had not done... It was now 8 p.m., and we had not enough battery replacements to let our torches burn on forever. We had done so much of our studying and copying below the glacial level that our battery supply had had at least 5 hours of nearly continuous use, and despite the special dry cell formula would obviously be good for only about 4 more. Though, by keeping one torch unused, except for especially interesting or difficult places, we might manage to eke out a safe margin beyond that. It would not do to be without a light in these Cyclopean catacombs, hence, in order to make the Abyss trip, we must give up all further mural deciphering. Of course, we intended to revisit the place for days and perhaps weeks of intensive study and photography, curiosity having long since gotten the better of horror. But just now we must hasten. Our supply of trailblazing paper was far from unlimited, and we were reluctant to sacrifice spare notebooks or sketching paper to augment it, but we did let one large notebook go. If worst came to worst, we could resort to rock chipping, and of course it would be possible, even in case of really lost direction, to work up to full daylight by one channel or another if granted sufficient time for plentiful trial and error. So at last we set off eagerly into the indicated direction of the nearest tunnel. According to the carvings from which we had made our map, the desired tunnel mouth could not be much more than a quarter mile from where we stood, the intervening space shewing solid-looking buildings quite likely to be penetrable still at a subglacial level. The opening itself would be in the basement, on the angle nearest the foothills, of a vast five-pointed structure of evidently public and perhaps ceremonial nature, which we tried to identify from our aerial survey of the ruins. No such structure came to our minds as we recalled our flight, hence we concluded that its upper parts had been greatly damaged, or that it had been totally shattered in an ice rift we had noticed. In the latter case, the tunnel would probably turn out to be choked, so that we would have to try the next nearest one, the one less than a mile to the north. The intervening river course prevented our trying any more of the southerly tunnels of this trip, and indeed, if both of the neighboring ones were choked, it was doubtful whether our batteries would warrant an attempt on the next northerly one, about a mile beyond our second choice. As we threaded our dim way through the labyrinth, with the aid of a map and compass, traversing rooms and corridors in every stage, of ruin or preservation, clambering up ramps, crossing upper floors and bridges, and clambering down again, encountering choked doorways and piles of debris, hastening now and then along finely preserved and uncannily immaculate stretches, taking false leads and retracing our way, in such cases removing the blind paper trail we had left, and once in a while striking the bottom of an open shaft through which daylight poured or trickled down, we were repeatedly tantalized by the sculptured walls along our route. Many must have told tales of immense historical importance, and only the prospect of later visits reconciled us to the need of passing them by. As it was, we slowed down once in a while and turned on our second torch. If we had more films, we would certainly have paused briefly to photograph some bas-reliefs, but time-consuming hand copying was clearly out of the question. I come now once more to a place where the temptation to hesitate, or to hint rather than state, is very strong. It is necessary, however, to reveal the rest in order to justify my course in discouraging further exploration. We had wormed our way very close to the computed side of the tunnel's mouth, having crossed a second-story bridge to what seemed plainly the tip of a pointed wall, and descended to a ruinous corridor especially rich in decadently elaborate and apparently ritualistic sculptures of late workmanship, when, about 8:30 p.m., Danforth's keen young nostrils gave us the first hint of something unusual. If we had a dog with us... I need to change the page. If we had a dog with us, I suppose we would have been warned before. At first, we could not precisely say what was wrong with the formerly crystal-pure air, but after a few seconds, our memories reacted only too definitely. Let me try to state the thing without flinching. There was an odor, and that odor was vaguely, subtly, and unmistakably akin to what had nauseated us upon opening the insane grave of the Hoare Lake had dissected. Of course, the revelation was not as clearly cut at the time as it sounds now. There were several conceivable explanations, and we did a good deal of indecisive whispering. Most important of all, we did not retreat without further investigation. For having come this far, we were loath to be balked at by anything short of certain disaster. Anyway, what we must have suspected was altogether too wild to believe. Such things did not happen in any normal world. Such things did not happen in any normal world. It was probably sheer irrational instinct which made us dim our single torch, tempted no longer by the decadent and sinister sculptures that leered menacingly from the oppressive walls, and which softened our progress to a cautious tiptoeing and crawling over the increasingly littered floor and heaps of debris. Yeah, we've been making good progress. It's been a bit slower than it could be because I've been looking away from the screen and haven't been playing quite optimally. But I feel like reading this is helping this be less monotonous. So even if it takes a bit longer to do it while reading, I think it's a good idea. Danforth's eyes, as well as nose, proved better than mine, for it was likewise he who first noticed. Danforth's eyes, as well as nose, proved better than mine, for it was likewise he who first noticed the queer aspect of the debris after we had passed many half-choked arches leading to chambers and corridors on the ground level. Hello, Simon Tex. It did not look quite as it ought after countless thousands of years of desertion, and when we cautiously turned on more light, we saw that a kind of swath seemed to have been lately tracked through it. The irregular nature of the litter precluded any definite marks, but in the smoother places there were suggestions of the dragging of heavy objects. Once we thought there was a hint of parallel tracks, as if of runners. This was what made us pause again. It was during that pause that we caught, simultaneously this time, the other odor ahead. Paradoxically, it was both a less frightful and a more frightful odor. Less frightful intrinsically, but infinitely appalling in this place under the known circumstances. Unless, of course, Gedney. For the odor was the plain and familiar one of common petrol, everyday gasoline. Our motivation after that is something I will leave to psychologists. We knew now that some terrible extension of the camp horrors must have crawled into this nighted burial place of the eons, hence could not doubt. God, trying to read these sentences, like, I'm looking at them for a couple seconds, trying to guess what the intended flow of the sentences is, and then I look away at the screen to see Retinazer, and then I come back, and like the sentence takes a completely different turn, because the way of writing is hard to inflect on with modern English. It's just not how you write anymore. We knew now that some terrible extension of the camp horrors must have crawled into this nighted burial place of the eons, hence could not doubt. Like, I feel like he's supposed to say, hence we could not doubt any longer the existence of nameless conditions, but he doesn't say we, he just says hence could not doubt. And like, I don't know how the fuck you're supposed to, like, is it hence could not doubt? But I don't know how to give the flow of that sentence without putting we in there, so I'm just gonna put we in there. We knew now that some terrible extension of the camp horrors must have crawled into this nighted burial place of the eons, hence we could not doubt any longer the existence of nameless conditions, present or at least recent, just ahead. Essentially, what's been going on? Dog is dead 7 hours plus a 6-hour attempt. He died. Why'd you do this? Are you gonna keep going with Calamity? Are you planning to do like Supreme Calamities in the Exomex? What's your cutoff point? You doing all bosses? Calamity's number scaling is rough. Well, good luck. Does the anchor have piercing? I forget. I feel like once you get to like Supreme Calamities Exomex, that's gonna be a fucking nightmare. I do not envy you having to do that. The number inflation. You're not doing Old Duke? But yes, essentially what's been going on in the story is Danforth and the narrator are at this point, after in their search of the underwater city, have encountered... Is my water? Yeah, it's my water. A strange scent. Which was the same scent that they had encountered at the massacre that occurred at the other half of the party, Lake's camp, where the creatures that they had dug up from the subterranean limestone caverns had disappeared in the midst of a storm, and virtually all of the party had been systematically murdered and dissected, save for one man, Gedney, and one dog. In addition to this, they also encountered the scent of gasoline, indicating to them, without any shadow of a doubt, that something from the camp, whether it be Gedney, the creatures, or something else entirely, had been here. Or, possibly, is still there. Yet in the end, we did let sheer burning curiosity, or anxiety, or auto-hypnotism, or vague thoughts of responsibility toward Gedney, or whatnot. Yet in the end, we did let sheer burning curiosity, or anxiety, or auto-hypnotism, or vague thoughts of responsibility toward Gedney, or whatnot, drive us on. Danforth whispered again of the print he thought he had seen at the alley turning into the ruins above, and of the faint musical piping, potentially of tremendous significance in the light of Lake's dissection report, despite its close resemblance to the cave-mouth echoes of the Windy Peaks, which he thought he had shortly afterward half-heard from unknown depths below. I, in my turn, whispered of how the camp was left, of what had disappeared, and of how the madness of a lone survivor might have conceived the inconceivable, a wild trip across the monstrous mountains and a descent into the unknown primal masonry. But we could not convince each other, or even ourselves, of anything definite. We had turned off all light as we stood still, and vaguely noticed that a trace of deeply filtered upper day kept the blackness from being absolute. Having automatically begun to move ahead, we guided ourselves by occasional flashes from our torch. The disturbed debris formed an impression we could not shake off, and the smell of gasoline grew stronger. More and more ruin met our eyes and hampered our feet, until very soon we saw that the forward way was about to cease. We had been all too correct in our pessimistic guess about the rift glimpsed from the air. Our tunnel quest was a blind one, and we were not even going to be able to reach the basement out of which the abyss... Let me restart that sentence. We had been all too correct in our pessimistic guess about that rift glimpsed from the air. Our tunnel quest was a blind one, and we were not even going to be able to reach the basement out of which the abyssward aperture opened. Essentially, they were saying that the path into the Stygian Sea in which the second city was made, the first one, the closest one, had been destroyed by an ice rift they had spotted while flying over, and they're unable to penetrate it here. The torch, flashing over the grotesquely cavern walls of the blocked corridor on which we stood, shewed several doorways in various states of obstruction, and from one of them the gasoline odor, quite submerging that other hint. The torch, flashing over the grotesquely carven walls of the blocked corridor in which we stood, shewed several doorways in various states of obstruction, and from one of them the gasoline odor, quite submerging that other hint of odor, came with a special distinctiveness. As we looked more steadily, we saw that beyond a doubt there had been a slight and recent clearing away of debris from that particular opening. Whatever the lurking horror might be, we believed the direct avenue toward it was now plainly made manifest. I do not think anyone will wonder that we waited an appreciable time before making any further motion. And yet, when we did venture inside that black arch, our first impression was one of anticlimax. For amidst the littered expanse of that sculptured crypt, a perfect cube with sides of about 20 feet, there remained no recent object of instantly discernible size, so that we looked instinctively, though in vain, for a farther doorway. In another moment, however, Danforth's sharp vision had descried a place where the floor debris had been disturbed, and we turned on both torches full strength. Though what we saw in that light was actually simple and trifling, I am nonetheless reluctant to tell of it because of what it implied. It was a rough leveling of the debris, upon which several small objects lay carelessly scattered, and at one corner of which a considerable amount of... I need to change the page. And at one corner of which a considerable amount of gasoline must have been spilled and at one side of which a considerable amount of gasoline must have been spilled, lately enough to leave a strong odor even at this extreme superplateau altitude. In other words, it could not be other than a sort of camp. A camp made by questing beasts who, like us, had been turned back by the unexpectedly choked way to the abyss. Let me be plain. The scattered objects were, so far as substance was concerned, all from Lake's camp, and consisted of tin cans as queerly opened as those we had seen at that ravaged place, many spent matches, 3 illustrated books more or less curiously smudged, an empty ink bottle with its pictorial and instructional carton, a broken fountain pen, some oddly snipped fragments of fur and tent cloth, a used electric battery with circular of directions, a folder that came with our type of tent heater, and a sprinkling of crumpled papers. It was all bad enough, but when we smoothed out the papers and looked at what was on them, we felt we had come to the worst. We had found certain inexplicably blotted papers at the camp which might have prepared us, yet the effect of the sight down there in the pre-human vaults of the Nightmare City was almost too much to bear. A mad Gedney might have made the groups of dots in imitation of those found on the greenish soapstones, just as the dots of those insane 5-pointed grave mounds might have been made, and he might conceivably have prepared rough, hasty sketches, varying in their accuracy, or lack of it, which outlined the neighboring parts of the city and traced the way from a circularly represented place outside our previous route, a place we identified as a great cylindrical tower in the carvings and a vast circular gulf glimpsed in our aerial survey. To the present 5-pointed struggle... I need to reread that sentence. That is a mouthful. A mad Gedney might have made the groups of dots in imitation of those found on the greenish soapstones, just as the dots of those insane 5-pointed grave mounds might have been made, and he might conceivably have prepared rough, hasty sketches, varying in their accuracy or lack of it, which outlined the neighboring parts of the city and traced the way from a circular represented place outside our previous route, a place we identified as a great cylindrical tower in the carvings and a vast circular gulf glimpsed in our aerial survey, to the present 5-pointed structure in the tunnel mouth therein. He might, I repeat, have prepared such sketches, for those before us were quite obviously compiled as our own had been from late sculptures somewhere in the glacial labyrinth, though not from ones we had seen and used. But what this outblind bungler could never have done was to execute those sketches in a strange and assured technique perhaps superior, despite haste and carelessness, to any of the decadent carvings from which they were taken. The characteristic and unmistakable technique of the old ones themselves in the dead city's heyday. There are those who will say Danforth and I were utterly mad not to flee for our lives after that, since our conclusions were now, notwithstanding their wildness, completely fixed, and of a nature I need not mention to those who have read my account so far as this. Perhaps we were mad. For have I not said these horrible peaks were mountains of madness? But I think I can detect something of the same spirit, albeit in a less extreme form, in the men who stalk deadly beasts through African jungles to photograph them or study their habitats. Half paralyzed with terror though we were, there was nevertheless fanned within us a blazing flame of awe and curiosity which triumphed in the end. Of course, we did not mean to face that, or those which we knew had been there, but we felt that they must be gone by now. They would by this time have found the other neighboring entrance to the abyss, and have passed within to whatever night-black fragments of the past might await them in the ultimate gulf they had never seen. Or if that entrance, too, was blocked, they would have gone on to the north, seeking another. They were, we remembered, partly independent of light. Looking back to that moment, I can scarcely recall just what precise form our new emotions took, just what change of immediate objective it was that sharpened our sense of expectancy. We certainly did not mean to face what we feared, yet I will not deny that we may have had a lurking, unconscious wish to spy certain things from some hidden vantage point. Probably we had not given up our zeal to glimpse the abyss itself, though there was interposed a new goal in the form of that great circular place shewn on the crumpled sketches we had found. We had at once recognized it as the monstrous cylindrical tower figuring in the very earliest carvings, but appearing only as a prodigious round aperture from above. Something about the impressiveness of its rendering, even in these hasty diagrams, made us think that its subglacial levels must still form a feature of peculiar importance. Perhaps it embodied architectural marvels as yet uncountered by us. I don't need to care about an eclipse. They can't get through these walls. It was certainly of incredible age according to the sculptures in which it figured, being indeed among the first things built in the city. Its carvings, if preserved, could not be but the highest thing. Its carvings, if preserved, could not be but highly significant. Moreover, it might form a good present link with the upper world, a shorter route than the one we were so carefully blazing, and probably that by which those others had descended. At any rate, buff heal. At any rate, the thing we did was to study the terrible sketches, which quite perfectly confirmed our own, and start back over the indicated course to the circular place. The course which our nameless predecessors might have traversed twice before us. The other neighboring gate to the abyss would lie beyond that. I need not speak of our journey, during which we continued to leave an economical trail of paper, for it was precisely the same in kind as that by which we had reached the cul-de-sac, except that it tended to adhere more closely to the ground level and even descend to basement corridors. Every now and then we could trace certain disturbing marks in the debris or litter underfoot. And after we had passed outside the radius of the gasoline scent, we were again faintly conscious, spasmodically, of that more hideous and more persistent scent. After the way had branched from our former course, we sometimes gave the rays of our single torch... Hold on. After the way had branched from our former course, we sometimes gave the rays of our single torch a furtive sweep along the walls, noting in almost every case the well-nigh omnipresent sculptures, which indeed seemed to have formed a main aesthetic outlet for the old ones. So at this point, just a story recap in case you had missed some of these details. Danforth, in the narrator, having attempted to find the first staircase down to the Stygian sea beneath them, where the second city had been made, and failing due to its collapse at the hands of an ice rift, had instead found unmistakable evidence that the creatures unearthed by Lake in the limestone caverns were not only alive, but the beings responsible for the death of Lake and his companions, and that they had been following the exact same course as Danforth in the narrator, both of them seeking to uncover a path down to the Stygian city beneath the surface. So essentially a story recap as a whole. Danforth is a student at Miskatonic University, and the narrator is a professor at Miskatonic University, which is a small university in Boston. Oh, sorry, not in Boston, in Massachusetts. And they had gone on an expedition to Antarctica with several of their colleagues and other graduate students to try to collect rock specimens and uncover more information about life in Antarctica. Using a new drilling apparatus that Probody, one of their colleagues, had made. And through the use of this new drilling apparatus, they did find new information. Information that did not comply with their understanding of the world as a whole, because it indicated the presence of extremely complex and intelligent life, predating by millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years, human life, sentient life as they knew it. A large part of the expedition had gone off to the Mountains of Madness, while several of them stayed behind at intermediate camps. They had been receiving radio signals but eventually got radio silence from Lake and his colleagues and, upon investigating in their only remaining plane, found the camp to have been massacred by strange and alien means. This was after Lake had reported uncovering 8 intact specimens of strange life forms, which later Danforth and the narrator would discover to be the Old Ones, who had built a city in the Mountains of Madness, had come from space, essentially. They are celestial travelers who had come to Earth, colonizing it with great cities similar to the one they are currently exploring, and had created life on Earth, essentially. They had the means of creating life, although that secret had been lost to them with time, so they were no longer able to do it, and created all life, essentially to provide them either with sport for hunting, for food, or for physical labor. As time progressed, the city declined and collapsed due to the encroaching cold of the Ice Age, driving those who had lived in the city, the Old Ones, either underground to an underground sea, where a second city had been built, or back into the depths of the ocean, away from the Antarctic. The narrator and Danforth are currently on foot in the city amidst the Mountains of Madness, searching for a way down into that second city to find out what became of it, because the information they're able to collect on the surface as to this city's history and the history of the ancient Old Ones only goes so far, and it mostly presents a decline at the time of the Ice Age and the migration elsewhere. However, it is evident to them, after the most recent discoveries, that the creatures that Lake had uncovered at his camp were following the same goal as them. They were also here, sketching their own maps of the city, uncovering what had become of their people, and attempting to find a way down to that subterranean city. They are now essentially following in the footsteps of the 8 surviving ancient elder Old Ones, as they attempt to delve their way beneath the Mountains of Madness. But yes, it is certainly not easy to parse and understand what's going on here. Cthulhu lore? These are not... this is not Cthulhu lore. The Cthulhu... what were they called? Spawn of Cthulhu? Something to the effect of Spawn of Cthulhu. I think they had come from Pluto? No, the Migo had come from Pluto. Where did this Spawn of Cthulhu come from? I don't remember. I don't think they established where the Spawn of Cthulhu came from. But the Cthulhu beings were one that the Old Ones had battled in a war. And these wars, particularly against the Migo, I believe, were the reason that they retreated back to the Antarctic into their great cities and did not colonize further the rest of the planet. At least on land. We're almost at 9K though. Around 9:30 p.m., while traversing a vaulted corridor whose increasingly glaciated floor seemed somewhat below the ground level and whose roof grew longer as we advanced, we began to see strong daylight ahead and were able to turn off our torch. It appeared that we were coming to the vast circular place and that our distance from the upper air could not be very great. The corridor ended in an arch surprisingly low for these megalithic ruins, but we could see much through it even before we emerged. Beyond there stretched a prodigious round space, fully 200 feet in diameter, strewn with debris and containing many choked archways corresponding to the one we were about to cross. It's already been over an hour? Yeah. Which I guess is a good measure. If we're doing... Honestly, it looks like about 3,000 damage an hour is accurate, because 12,000 is about his second phase. We started at around 3 p.m., but we also had to get him into his second phase. So I think probably about 4 hours a reasonable guess. Probably another 3 hours from now. Hey, Lip Power. The walls were, in available spaces, boldly sculptured into a spiral band of heroic proportions, and displayed, despite the destructive weathering caused by the openness of the spot, an artistic splendor far beyond anything we had encountered before. The littered floor was quite heavily glaciated, and we fancied that the true bottom lay at a considerably lower depth. But the salient object of the place was the titanic stone ramp which, eluding the archways by a sharp turn outward onto the open floor, wound spirally up the stupendous cylindrical wall like an inside counterpart of those once climbing... This is all one sentence. But the salient object of the place was the titanic stone ramp, which, eluding the archways by a sharp turn outward into the open floor, wound spirally up the stupendous cylindrical wall like an inside counterpart to those once climbing outside the monstrous towers of ziggurats of ancient Babylon. Towers or ziggurats of ancient Babylon. Only the rapidity of our flight and the perspective which confounded the descent with the tower's inner wall, had prevented our noticing this feature from the air, and thus caused us to seek another avenue to the subglacial level. Bodhi might have been able to tell what sort of engineering held it in place, but Danforth and I could merely admire and marvel. We could see mighty stone corbels and pillars here and there, but what we saw seemed inadequate to the function performed. The thing was excellently preserved up to the present top of the tower, a highly remarkable circumstance in view of its exposure, and its shelter had done much to protect the bizarre and disturbing cosmic sculptures on the walls. As we stepped out into the awesome half-daylight of this monstrous cylinder bottom, 50 million years old, and without a doubt the most primally ancient structure ever to meet our eyes, we saw that the ramp-traverse side stretched dizzily to a height of fully 60 feet. This, we recalled from our aerial survey, meant an outside glaciation of some 40 feet, since the yawning gulf we had seen from the plane had been at the top of an approximately 20-foot mound of crumbled masonry, somewhat sheltered for 3/4 of its circumference by the massive curving wall of a line of higher ruins. According to the sculptures, the original tower had stood in the center of an immense circular plaza, and had been perhaps 500 or 600 feet high, with tiers of horizontal discs near the top and a row of needle-like spires along the upper rim. Most of the masonry had obviously toppled outward rather than inward, a fortunate happening since otherwise the ramp might have been shattered and the whole interior choked. As it was, the ramp shewed sad battering, whilst the choking was such that all the archways at the bottom seemed to have been recently half cleared. It took us only a moment to conclude that this was indeed the route by which those others had descended, and that this would be the logical route for our own descent despite the long trail of paper we had left elsewhere. The tower's mouth was no farther from the foothills in our waiting plain than was the great terraced building which we had encountered, and any further subglacial exploration we might make on this trip would lie in this general region. Oddly, we were still thinking about possible later trips, even after all we had seen and guessed. Then, as we picked our way cautiously over the debris of the great floor, there came a sight which for the time excluded all other matters. It was the neatly huddled array of 3 sledges in that farther angle of the ramp's lower and outward projecting course which had hitherto been screened from our view. There they were, the 3 sledges missing from Lake's camp, shaken by a hard usage which must have included forcible dragging along great reaches of snowless masonry and debris, as well as much hand portage over utterly unnavigable places. They were carefully and intelligently packed and strapped, and contained things memorably familiar enough: the gasoline stove, fuel cans, instrument cases, provision tins, tarpaulins obviously bulging with books, and some bulging with less obvious contents, everything derived from Lake's equipment. After what we had found in that room, we were in a measure prepared for this encounter. The really great shock came when we stepped over and undid one tarpaulin whose outlines had peculiarly disquieted us. It seemed that others as well as Lake had been interested in collecting typical specimens, for there were two here, both stiffly frozen, perfectly preserved, patched with adhesive plaster, which some wounds around the neck had occurred, and wrapped with Okay, I need to look away from the screen to read this sentence, because this is... He's describing piles of equipment and things that had been taken from Lake's camp, undoubtedly by the old ones that Lake had unearthed, and been left here in the great circular structure within which was a ramp leading down to the subterranean depths. The really great shock came when we stepped over and undid one tarpaulin whose outlines had peculiarly disquieted us. It seems that others, as well as Lake, had been interested in collecting typical specimens, for there were two here, both stiffly frozen. It seems that others, as well as Lake, had been interested in collecting typical specimens, for there were two here, both stiffly frozen, perfectly preserved, patched with adhesive plaster where some wounds around the neck had occurred, and wrapped with patent care to prevent further damage. They were the bodies of young Gedney and the missing dog. Chapter 10. Many people will probably judge us callous as well as mad for thinking about the northward tunnel and the abyss so soon after our somber discovery, and I am not prepared to say that we would have immediately revived such thoughts but for a specific circumstance which broke in upon us and set up a whole new train of speculations. We had replaced the tarpaulin over poor Gedney and were standing in a kind of mute bewilderment when the sounds finally reached our consciousness. The first sounds we had heard since descending out of the open where the mountain wind whined faintly from its unearthly heights. Well known and mundane they were, their presence in this remote world of death was more unexpected and unnerving than any grotesque or fabulous tones could possibly have been, since they gave a fresh upsetting to all our notions of cosmic harmony. Had it been some trace of that bizarre musical piping over a wide range which Lake's dissection report had led us to expect in those others, and which indeed our overwrought fancies had been reading into every wind howl we had heard since coming on the camp horror, it would have been a kind of hellish congruity with the eon-dead region around us. A voice from other epochs belonging in a graveyard of other epochs. Oh no, a voice from other epochs belongs in a graveyard of other epochs. As it was, however, the noise shattered all of our profoundly seated adjustments, all our tacit acceptance of the inner Antarctic as a waste of utterly and irrevocably void of every vestige of normal life as the sterile disk of the moon. What we heard was not the fabulous note of any buried blasphemy of Elder Earth from whose What we heard was not the fabulous note of any What we heard was not the fabulous note of any buried blasphemy of Elder Earth from whose supernal toughness of age-denied polar sun had evoked a monstrous response. Instead, it was a thing so mockingly normal and unerringly familiarized by our sea days off Victoria Land and our camp days at McMurdo Sound that we shuddered to think of it here, where such things ought not to be. To be brief, it was simply the raucous squawking of a penguin. The muffled sound floated from subglacial recesses nearly opposite to the corridor whence we had come, regions manifestly in the direction of that other tunnel to the vast abyss. The presence of a living water bird in such a direction in a world whose surface was one of age-long and uniform lifelessness could lead to only one conclusion. Hence, our first thought was to verify the objective reality of the sound. It was, indeed, repeated and seemed at times to come from more than one throat. Seeking its source, we entered an archway from which much debris had been cleared, resuming our trailblazing, with an added paper supply taken with curious repugnance from one of the tarpaulin bundles on the sledges, when we left daylight behind. As the glaciated floor gave place to a litter of detritus, we plainly discerned some curious dragging tracks, and once Danforth found a distinct print of a sort whose description would be only to... God, please. It's having to look away that's really messing up my ability to look at to do this, because I have to keep looking away to look at Retinazer to make sure I'm teleporting correctly, and I lose track of the flow of the sentence whenever that happens. I'm just going to leave Lovecraft for the rest of the stream. I'm at least going to finish this book. We'll reconsider after that. But I'm at the very least going to finish At the Mountains of Madness, because we're almost done. We got like 16 pages left. As the glaciated floor gave place to a litter of detritus, we plainly discerned some curious dragging tracks, and once Danforth found a distinct print of a sort whose description would be only too superfluous. The course indicated by the penguin cries was precisely what our map and compass prescribed as an approach to the more northerly tunnel mouth, and we were glad to find that a bridgeless thoroughfare on the ground and basement level seemed open. The tunnel, according to the chart, ought to start from the basement of a large pyramidal structure which we seemed vaguely to recall from our aerial survey as remarkably well preserved. Along our path, the single torch shewed a customary profusion of carvings, but we did not pause to examine any of those. Suddenly, a bulky, white shape loomed up ahead of us, and we flashed on the second torch. It is odd how wholly this new quest had turned our minds from earlier fears of what might lurk near. Those other ones, having left their supplies in the great circular place, must have planned to return after their scouting trip toward or into the abyss, yet we had now discarded all caution concerning them as complexity as if they were never... Those other ones, having left their supplies in the great circular place, must have planned to return after their scouting trip toward or into the abyss, yet we had now discarded all caution concerning them as completely as if they had never existed. This white, waddling thing was fully 6 feet high, yet we seemed to realize at once that it was not one of those others. They were larger and dark, and according to the sculptures, their motion over land surfaces was as swift. Yet we seemed to realize at once that it was not one of those others. They were larger and dark, and according to the sculptures, their motion over land surfaces was a swift, assured matter despite the queerness of their sea-borne tentacle equipment. But to say that the white thing did not profoundly frighten us would be vain. We were indeed clutched for an instant by a primitive dread almost sharper than the worst of our reasoned fears regarding those others. Then came a flash of anticlimax as the white shape sidled into a lateral archway to our left to join 2 others of its kinds which had summoned it in raucous tones. For it was only a penguin, albeit of a huge unknown species larger than the greatest of the known king penguins, and monstrous in its combined albinism and virtual eyelessness. When we had followed the thing into the archway and turned both our torches on the indifferent and unheeding group of the three we saw, When we had followed the thing into the archway and turned both our torches on the indifferent and unheeding group of the three we saw, Okay. We saw is not referring to the 3. It is just the beginning of a separate thought within that sentence. When we had followed the thing into the archway and turned both our torches on the indifferent and unheeding group of 3, we saw that they were all eyeless albinos of the same unknown and gigantic species. Their size reminded us of some of the archaic penguins depicted in the Old One's sculptures, and it did not take long for us to conclude that they were descended from the same stock, undoubtedly surviving through a retreat to some warmer inner region whose perpetual blackness had destroyed their pigmentation and atrophied their eyes to mere useless slits. At the Mountains of Madness, Marley. We're about 15 pages from finishing the book. That their present habitat was the vast abyss we sought was not for a moment to be doubted, as this evidence of the Gulf's continued warmth and habitability filled us with the most curious and subtly perturbing fancies. To give you a recap of what's been going on, the narrator and Danforth are still in their expedition into the ancient city of the Old Ones within the Mountain of Madness. At this point, they have concluded 3 facts. The first is that the Old Ones that had been inhabiting the city in the Mountains of Madness had abandoned that city at the coming of the Ice Age, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when the polar ice caps had frozen. They had fled either out to cities underneath the ocean, or many of them to a second city built underground within the Mountains of Madness themselves, a subterranean Stygian sea, which promised greater protection from the elements than that of the surface. The second conclusion is that what happened at Lake's camp was undoubtedly the result of 8 surviving Old Ones, which Lake had disturbed from their slumber beneath the surface. The third conclusion is that the Old Ones, which Lake had unearthed, sought to reap the same fruits as Danforth and the narrator. They too returned to the city amidst the Mountains of Madness, and sought to return and discover a path down to the subterranean sea in which the rest of the Old Ones had retreated. As of now, Danforth and the narrator are at the cusp of the tunnel leading down to that sea. They have discovered massive 6-foot-tall penguins completely blind after having retreated to subterranean life, apparently having survived for hundreds of thousands of years, indicating, at the very least, the continued survival of some amount of life beneath the Mountains of Madness. We wondered, too, what had caused these 3 birds to venture out of their usual domain. The state and silence of the Great Dead City made it clear that it had at no time been an habitual seasonal rookery. The state and silence of the Great Dead City made it clear that it had at no time been a habitual seasonal rookery, whilst the manifest indifference of the trio to our presence made it seem odd that any passing party of those others should have startled them. Was it possible that those others had taken some aggressive action or tried to increase their meat supply? We doubted whether their pungent odor, which the dogs had hated, could cause an equal antipathy in these penguins, since their ancestors had obviously lived on excellent terms with the Old Ones, an amicable relationship which must have survived in the abyss below as long as any of the Old Ones remained. Regretting, in a flare-up of the old spirit of pure science, that we could not photograph these anomalous creatures, we shortly left them to their squawking and pushed on toward an abyss whose openness was now so positively proved to us, and whose exact direction occasional penguin tracks made clear. Hey, Arestico. Not long afterward, a steep descent in a long, low, doorless, and peculiarly sculptureless corridor led us to believe that we were approaching the tunnel mouth at last. We had passed 2 more penguins and heard others immediately ahead. Then the corridor ended in a prodigious open space which made us gasp involuntarily. A perfect inverted hemisphere, obviously deep underground, fully 100 feet in diameter and 50 feet high, with low archways opening around all parts of the circumference but one, and that one yawning cavernously with a black arched aperture which broke the symmetry of the vault to a height of nearly 15 feet. It was the entrance to the Great Abyss. Why is there always a blood zombie at night? The blood zombie's just always there. It spawned during a blood moon and just hasn't despawned. In this vast hemisphere, whose concave roof was impressively, though decadently, carved to a likeness of the primordial celestial dome, a few albino penguins waddled. Aliens there, but indifferent and unseeing. The black tunnel yawned infinitely off at a steep descending grade, its aperture adorned with grotesquely chiseled jambs and lintel. From that cryptical mouth we fancied a current of slightly warmer air and perhaps even a suspicion of vapor proceeded, and we wondered what living entities other than penguins the limitless void below and the contiguous honeycombings of the land and Titan mountains might conceal. We wondered, too, whether the trace of mountaintop smoke at first suspected by Poor Lake, as well as the odd haze we had ourselves perceived around the rampart crowned peak, might not be caused by the tortuous channeled rising of some such vapor from the unfathomed regions of the Earth's core. Yes, we are almost done with the Mountains of Madness. There are like 14 pages left. I don't know if we're going to read another story after this, because it's rather difficult for me to read while also fighting Retinazer, but we might consider something else to do. Especially Lovecraft, because I'm a slow reader. I'm reading it out loud. It's not easy to read out loud. Because I don't want to read... Because reading Lovecraft quickly out loud is a fucking nightmare. Because these sentences are structured in such a confusing and difficult to read way that trying to stumble your way through that, reading it out loud in a way that flows, is... Doing it quickly is nigh impossible for me. Entering the tunnel... Hey, Bismarck. Entering the tunnel, we saw that its outline was, at least at the start, about 15 feet each way. Sides, floor, and arched roof composed of the usual megalithic masonry. Read the entire Bible in one stream? I'll pass. But yes, for those of you that missed it, to give another quick recap of the things that have been going on, Danforth and the narrator are currently venturing into the second subterranean city created by the Old Ones as a retreat from the city within the Mountains of Madness atop the plateau. And it is without doubt to them that life still resides within this abyss beneath the Mountains of Madness. The only life they've seen such far are massive albino penguins. But this is where they venture into what is presumably the surviving city of the Old Ones. The sides were sparsely decorated with cartouches of conventional designs in a late decadent style, and all the construction and carving were marvelously well preserved. Tax collector died. He's not the brightest. The floor was quite clear, except for a slight detritus bearing outgoing penguin tracks and the inward tracks of those others. The farther one advanced, the warmer it became, so that we were soon unbuttoning our heavy garments. We wondered whether there was actually igneous manifestations below, and whether the waters of that sunless sea were hot. After a short distance, the masonry gave place to solid rock, though the tunnel kept the same proportions and presented the same aspect of curved regularity. Occasionally, its varying grade became so steep that grooves were cut in the floor. Several times we noted the mouths of small lateral galleries not recorded in our diagrams, none of them such as to complicate the problem of our return, and all of them welcome as possible refuges in case we melt. Could I have made the fight AFK? I don't know, Canatop, because the problem is if I spam teleport, Retinazer stays up top. Like, I think if I just spam teleport here. Actually, no, it kind of does work. Never mind. No, we can't just do this. Our damage, our DPS has gone down by doing this, though. But I don't know if that overall, let's see, 65, how many... You know, I think this does work out better. Now I don't have to look at the game. Several times we noted the mouths of small lateral galleries not recorded in our diagrams. None of them such as to complicate the problem of our return, and all of them as welcome as possible refuges in case we met unwelcome entities on their way back from the abyss. The nameless scent of such things was very distinct. Doubtless it was suicidally foolish to venture into that tunnel under the known conditions, but the lure of the unplumbed is stronger in certain persons than most suspect. Indeed, it was just such a lure which had brought us to this unearthly polar waste in the first place. We saw several penguins as we passed along and speculated on the distance we would have to traverse. The carvings had led us to expect a steep downhill walk of about a mile to the abyss, but our previous wanderings had shewn us that matters of scale were not wholly to be depended upon. After about a quarter of a mile, that nameless scent became greatly accentuated, and we kept very careful track of the various lateral openings we passed. There was no visible vapor as at the mouth, but this was doubtless due to the lack of contrast in cooler air. The temperature was rapidly ascending, and we were not surprised to come upon a careless heap of material shuddering. The temperature was rapidly ascending, and we were not surprised to come upon a careless heap of material shudderingly familiar to us. It was composed of furs and tent cloth taken from Lake's camp, and we did not pause to study the bizarre forms into which the fabrics had been slashed. Slightly beyond this point, we noticed a decided increase in the size and number of the side galleries, and concluded that the densely honeycombed region beneath the higher foothills must now have been reached. The nameless scent was now curiously mixed with another, and scarcely less offensive odor. Of what nature we could not guess, though we thought of decaying organisms and perhaps unknown subterranean fungi. Then came a startling expansion of the tunnel for which the carvings had not prepared us, a broadening and rising into a lofty, natural-looking elliptical cavern with a level floor, some 75 feet long and 50 broad, and with many immense side passages leading away into cryptical darkness. We take damage pretty damn fast by this strategy, though, if we don't have our buffs up. We gotta be careful about that. Though this cavern was natural in appearance, an inspection with both torches suggested that it had been formed by the artificial destruction of several walls between adjacent honeycombings. The walls were rough, and the high vaulted roof was thick with stalactites, but the solid rock floor had been smoothed off and was free from all debris, detritus, and even dust to a positively abnormal extent. Except for the avenue through which we had come, this was true of the floors of all the great galleries opening off from it, and the singularity of the condition was such as to set us vainly puzzling. The curious new photo which had supplemented the nameless scent was excessively pungent here, so much so that it destroyed all trace of the other. Something about this whole place, with its polished and almost glistening floor, struck us as more vaguely baffling and horrible than any of the monstrous things we had previously encountered. The regularity of the passage immediately ahead, as well as the larger proportion of penguin droppings there, prevented all confusion as to the right course amidst this plethora of equally great cave mouths. Nevertheless, we resolved to resume our paper trailblazing if any further complexity should develop, for dust tracks, of course, could no longer be expected. Well, like sci-fi in book form, I don't really read books that often. AT-217, I'm not gonna lie. I usually spend my time with other activities. Upon resuming our direct progress, we cast a beam of torchlight over the tunnel walls, and stopped short in amazement at the supremely radical change which had come over the carvings in this part of the passage. We realized, of course, the great decadence of the Old One's sculpture at the time of the tunneling, and had indeed noticed the inferior workmanship of the arabesques in the stretches behind us. But now, in this deeper section beyond the cavern, there was a sudden difference wholly transcending explanation, a difference in basic nature as well as in mere quality, and involving so profound and calamitous a degradation of skill that nothing in the hitherto observed rate of decline could have led one to expect it. The new and degenerate work was coarse, bold, and wholly lacking in delicacy of detail. It was countersunk with exaggerated depth in bands following the same general line as the sparse cartouches of the earlier sections, but the height of the reliefs did not reach the level of the general surface. Danforth had the idea that it was a second carving, a sort of palimpsest, formed after the obliteration of a previous design. In nature, it was wholly decorative and conventional, and consisted of crude spirals and angles roughly following the quintile mathematical traditions of the old ones, yet seeming more like a parody than a perpetuation of that tradition. So at this point, if you didn't understand what I just said, they found that the artwork after the tunnel was greatly degraded in quality compared to the artwork depicted within the city on the surface. For whatever reason, whatever had carved these sculptures and murals upon the wall did so in a vastly inferior way to those they had previously encountered on the surface. Despite these, by all accounts, and with almost all certainty, being much later artistic depictions. We could not get it out of our minds that some subtly but profoundly alien element had been added to the aesthetic feeling behind the technique. We could not get it out of our minds that some subtly but profoundly alien element had been added to the aesthetic feeling behind the technique. An alien element, Danforth guessed, that was responsible for the manifestly laborious substitution. It was like, yet disturbingly unlike, what we had come to recognize as the Old One's art, and I was persistently reminded of such hybrid things as the ungainly Palmyrene sculptures fashioned in the Roman manner. That others had recently noticed this belt of carving was hinted by the presence of a used torch battery on the floor in front of one of the most characteristic designs. Some amount over 1.5 hours since Phase 2 began. Okay. And we've done about 5,500 damage, which I think is actually faster than 500 damage every... No. Wait. Yeah, I think it's a bit faster than 500 damage every 10 minutes. Because that would be 9 chunks of 500. You'd expect about... Actually, about right. I feel like it's repetitive. What, the book? Figuring things out. It drags on, but it doesn't drag on that much. I imagine it's easier to post these descriptions when reading it as opposed to reading it out loud, because you can reread it a couple times. It's an interesting enough story. Oh, the Arabic calligraphy thing. I'm not very familiar with Arabic calligraphy. Since we could not afford to spend any considerable amount of time in study, we resumed our advance after a cursory look, though frequently casting beams over the walls to see if any further decorative changes developed. Nothing of the sort was perceived, though the carvings were in places rather sparse because of the numerous mouths of smooth-floored lateral tunnels. We saw and heard fewer penguins, but thought we caught a vague suspicion of an infinitely distant chorus of them somewhere deep within the earth. The new and inexplicable odor was abominably strong, and we could detect scarcely a sign of that other nameless scent. Puffs of visible vapor ahead bespoke increasing contrasts in temperature and the relative nearness of the sunless sea cliffs of the great abyss. Then, quite unexpectedly, we saw certain obstructions on the polished floor ahead, obstructions which were quite definitely not penguins, and turned on our second torch after making sure that the objects were quite stationary. We're taking a bit of damage here. That's the problem with the spam strap. As we take damage faster, and we can't quite just expect spazmatism or Retinazer to die. Yeah, I think a 4-hour estimate for Phase 2 Retinazer was pretty accurate. Still another time I have come to a place where it is very difficult to proceed. I ought to be hardened by this stage, but there are some experiences and intimations which scar too deeply to permit of healing. I ought to be hardened by this stage, but there are some experiences and intimations which scar too deeply to permit of healing, and leave only such an added sensitiveness that memory re-inspires all the original horror. We saw, as I have said, certain obstructions on the polished floor ahead, and I may add that our nostrils were assailed almost simultaneously by a very curious intensification of the strange prevailing factor. Strange prevailing photor. I don't know what photor is. I really don't. Is that just like an antiquated word for odor? F-O-E-T-O-R. I'm not... He's speaking about the stench. I'm not familiar with that word, though. We saw, as I have said, certain obstructions on the polished floor ahead, and I may add that our nostrils were assailed almost simultaneously by a very curious intensification of the strange prevailing photor, now quite plainly mixed with the nameless stench of those others who had gone before us. The light of the second torch... Photor... Strong foul smell of the fetid of decay. Okay. So a strong fetid smell. I think he said something to the effect we have little doubt. I need to check this. The light of the second torch left. Hello? Why am I not teleporting? What's going on? That was weird. It's that weird smoke cursor spot where this teleporter didn't register correctly. The light of the second torch left little doubt as to what the obstructions were, and we dared approach them only because we could see, even from a distance, that they were quite as... The light of the second torch left no doubt as to what the obstructions were, and we dared approach them only because we could see, even from a distance, that they were quite as past all harming power as had been the 6 similar specimens unearthed from the monstrous star-mounted graves at Poor Lake's camp. They were, indeed, as lacking in completeness as most of those we had unearthed, though it grew plain from the thick, dark green pool gathering around them that their incompleteness was of infinitely greater recency. There seemed to only be 4 of them, whereas Lake's bulletins would have suggested no less than 8 as forming the group which had preceded us. To find them in this state was wholly unexpected, and we wondered what sort of monstrous struggle had occurred down here in the dark. What he's saying he uncovered is that the 8 specimens which had assaulted and massacred Lake's camp after being unearthed from the ground had evidently engaged in some great struggle here, a conflict. 4 of them lay unmistakably wounded and very likely dead on the floor of the immaculate hallway. Penguins, attacked in a body, retaliate savagely with their beaks, and our ears now made certain the existence of a rookery far beyond. Had those others disturbed such a place and aroused murderous pursuit? The obstructions did not suggest it, for penguin beaks against the tough tissue Lake had dissected could hardly account for the terrible damage our approaching glance was beginning to make out. Besides, the huge blind birds we had seen appeared to be singularly peaceful. Had there, then, been a struggle among those others, and were the absent 4 responsible? If so, where were they? We glanced. Were they close at hand and likely to form an immediate menace to us? We glanced anxiously at some of the smooth-floored lateral passages as we continued our slow and frankly reluctant approach. Whatever the conflict was, it had clearly been that which had frightened the penguins to their unaccustomed wandering. It must, then, have arisen near the faintly heard rookery in the incalculable gulf beyond, since there were no signs that any birds had normally dwelt here. Perhaps, we reflected, there had been a hideous running fight, with the weaker parties seeking to get back to the cached sledges when their pursuers finished them. One could picture the demonic fray between namelessly monstrous entities as it surged out of the black abyss with great clouds of frantic penguins squawking and scurrying ahead. Yeah, we're making good progress. I say that we approached those sprawling and incomplete obstructions slowly and reluctantly. Would to heaven we had never approached them at all, but had run back at top speed out of that blasphemous tunnel with the greasily smooth floors and the degenerate murals aping and mocking the things they had superseded. Run back before we had seen what we did, and before our minds were burned with something which will never let us breathe easily again. Both of our torches were turned on the prostrate objects, so that we soon realized the dominant factor in their incompleteness. Mauled, compressed, twisted, and ruptured as they were, their chief common injury was total decapitation. From each one, the tentacled starfish head had been removed, and as we drew near, we saw that the manner of removal looked more like hellish tearing or suction than any ordinary form of cleavage. Their noisome dark green ichor formed a large spreading pool, but its stench was half overshadowed by that newer and stranger stench, here more pungent than at any other point along our route. Only when we had come very close to the sprawling obstructions could we trace that second unexplainable photo to any immediate source, and the instant we did so, Danforth, remembering certain very vivid sculptures of the Old One's history in the Permian Age 150 million years ago, gave vent to a nerve-tortured cry which echoed hysterically through that vaulted and archaic passage with evil palimpsest carvings. I came only just short of echoing his cry myself, for I had seen those primal sculptures too, and had shudderingly admired the way the nameless artist had suggested that hideous slime coating found on certain incomplete and prostrate old ones, those whom the frightful Shoggoths had characteristically slain and sucked to a ghastly headlessness in the great war of resubjugation. They were infamous, nightmare sculptures even when telling of age-old bygone things, for Shoggoths in their work ought not to be seen by human beings or portrayed by any beings. The mad author of the Necronomicon had nervously tried to swear that none had been bred on this planet and that only drugged dreamers had ever conceived them. Formless protoplasm able to mock and reflect all forms of organs and processes. Vicious agglutinations of bubbling cells, rubbery 15-foot spheroids, infinitely plastic and ductile, slaves of suggestion, builders of cities, more and more sullen, more and more intelligent, more and more amphibious, more and more imitative. Great God! What madness made even those blasphemous old ones willing to use and carve such things? And now, when Danforth and I saw the freshly glistening and reflectively iridescent black slime which clung thickly to those headless bodies and stank obscenely with that new unknown odor, whose cause only a diseased fancy could envisage, clung to those bodies and sparkled less voluminously on a smooth part of the accursedly resculptured wall in a series of grouped dots, we understood the quality of cosmic fear to its uttermost depths. It was not fear of those four missing others, for all too well did we suspect they would do no harm again. Poor devils, after all, they were not evil things of their kind. They were the men of another age and of another order of being. Nature had played a hellish jest on them, as it will any others of that human madness, callousness, or cruelty may hereafter drag. Nature had played a hellish jest on them, as it will on any others that human madness, callousness, or cruelty may hereafter drag up in that hideously dead or sleeping polar waste, and this was their tragic homecoming. They had not been even savages, for what indeed had they done? That awful awakening in the cold of an unknown epoch, perhaps an attack by the furry, frantically barking quadrupeds and a dazed defense against them and the equally frantic white simians in their queer wrappings and paraphernalia. Poor Lake, poor Gedney, and poor old ones. Scientists to the last, what had they done that we would not have done in their place? God, what intelligence and persistence, what a facing of the incredible, just as those carven kinsmen and forebears had faced things only a little less incredible. Radiates, vegetables, monstrosities, starspawn, whatever they had been, they were men. They had crossed the icy peaks on whose templed slopes they had once worshipped and roamed among the tree ferns. They had found their dead city brooding under its curse, and had read its carven latter days as we had done. They had tried to reach their living fellows in fabled depths of blackness that they had never seen. And what had they found? All this flashed in unison, through the thoughts of Danforth and me as we looked from those headless, slime-coated shapes to the loathsome palimpsest sculptures and the diabolical dot groups of fresh slime on the wall beside them, looked and understood what must have triumphed and survived down there in the cyclopean water city of that nighted, penguin-fringed abyss, whence even now a sinister, curling mist had begun to belch pallidly as if an answer to Danforth's hysterical scream. The shock of recognizing that monstrous slime and headlessness had frozen us into mute, motionless statues, and it is only through later conversations that we have learned of the complete identity of our thoughts at that moment. It seemed eons that we stood there, but actually it could not have been more than 10 or 15 seconds. That hateful, pallid mist curled forward as if veritably driven by some remoter advancing bulk, and then came a sound which upset much of what we had just decided, and in doing so broke the spell and enabled us to run like mad past squawking confused penguins over our former trail back to the city, along ice-sunken megalithic corridors to the great open circle, and up that archaic spiral ramp to a frenzied automatic plunge for the same outer air and light of day. The new sound, as I have imitated, upset much that we had decided, because it was what poor Lake's dissection had led us to attribute to those we had just did. The new sound, as I have intimated, upset much of that we had decided, because it was what poor Lake's dissection had led us to attribute to those we had just judged dead. It was, Danforth later told me, precisely what he had caught in infinitely muffled form when at that spot beyond the alley corner above the glacial level, and it certainly had a shocking resemblance to the wind pipings we both heard around the lofty mountain caves. At the risk of seeming puerile, I will add another thing, too, if only because of the surprising way Danforth's impression chimed with mine. Of course, common reading is what prepared us both to make the interpretation, though Danforth has hinted at queer notions about unsuspected and forbidden sources to which Poe may have had access when writing his Arthur Gordon Pym a century ago. It will be remembered in that fantastic tale that there is a word of unknown but terrible and prodigious significance connected with the Antarctic and screamed eternally by gigantic spectrally snowy birds that malign... Okay, hold on. Of course, common reading is what prepared us both to make the interpretation, though Danforth has hinted at queer notions about unsuspected and forbidden sources to which Poe may have had access to when writing his Arthur Gordon Pym a century ago. It will be remembered that in that fantastic tale there was a word of unknown but terrible and prodigious significance connected with the Antarctic and screamed eternally by the gigantic, spectrally snowy birds of that malign region's core. To Kelly Lee, that I made... That's not ominous enough. No, I'm going to be way more ominous. To Kelly Lee. That, I may admit, is exactly what we thought we heard, conveyed by that sudden sound behind the advancing white mist, that insidious musical piping over a singularly wide range. We were in full flight before 3 notes or syllables had been uttered, though we knew that the swiftness of the old ones would enable any scream-roused and pursuing survivor of the slaughter to overtake us in a moment if it really wished to do so. We had a vague hope, however, that non-aggressive conduct and a display of kindred reason might cause such a being to spare us in case of capture, if only from scientific curiosity. After all, if such one had nothing to fear for itself, it would have no motive in harming us. Concealment being futile at this juncture, we used our torch for a running glance behind and perceived that the mist was thinning. Would we see, at last, a complete and living specimen of those others? Again came that insidious musical piping. To Kelly Lee. Then, noting that we were actually gaining on our pursuer, it occurred to us that the entity might be wounded. We could take no chances, however, since it was very obviously approaching in answer to Danforth's scream rather than in flight from any other entity. The timing was too close to admit of doubt. Of the whereabouts of that less conceivable and less mentionable nightmare, that fetid, unglimpsed mountain of slime-spewing protoplasm, that fetid, unglimpsed mountain of slime-spewing protoplasm whose race had conquered the abyss and sent land pioneers to recurve and squirm through the burrows of the hills, we could form no guess, and it cost us a genuine pang to leave this probably crippled old one, perhaps a lone survivor, to the peril of recapture and a nameless fate. Thank heaven we did not slacken our run. The curling mist had thickened again and was driving ahead with increased speed, whilst the straying penguins in our rear were squawking and screaming and displaying signs of a panic, really surprising in view of their relatively minor confusion when we had passed them. Once more came that sinister, wide-ranged piping. To Kelly Lee. To Kelly Lee. We had been wrong. The thing was not wounded, but had merely paused on encountering the bodies of its fallen kindred and the hellish slime inscription above them. We could never know what that demon message was, but those burials at Lake's camp had shewn how much importance the beings attached to their dead. Our recklessly used torch now revealed ahead of us the large open cavern where various ways converged, and we were glad to be leaving those morbid palimpsest sculptures, almost felt even when scarcely seen, behind. Another thought which the advent of the cave inspired was the possibility of losing our pursuer at this bewildering focus of large galleries. There were several of the blind albino penguins in the open space, and it seemed clear that their fear of the oncoming entity was extreme to the point of unaccountability. If at that point we dimmed our torch to the very lowest limit of traveling need, keeping it strictly in front of us, the frightened squawking motions of the huge birds in the mist might muffle our footfalls, screen our true course, and somehow set up a false lead. Amidst the churning, spiraling fog, the littered and unglistening floor of the main tunnel beyond this point, as differing from the other morbidly polished burrows, could hardly form a highly distinguishing feature, even, so far as we could conjecture, for those indicated special senses which made the old ones partly though imperfectly independent of light in emergencies. In fact, we were somewhat apprehensive lest we go astray ourselves in our haste. For we had, of course, decided to keep straight on toward the dead city, since the consequences of loss in those unknown foothill honeycombings would be unthinkable. The fact that we survived and emerged is sufficient proof that the thing did take a wrong gallery while we providentially hit on the right one. The penguins alone could not have saved us, but in conjunction with the mist they seemed to have done so. Only a benign fate kept the curling vapors thick enough at the right moment, for they were constantly shifting and threatening to vanish. Indeed, they did lift for a second just before we emerged from the nauseously resculptured tunnel into the cave, so that we actually caught one first and only half glimpse of the oncoming entity as we cast a final, desperately fearful glance backward before dimming the torch and mixing with the penguins in hope of dodging pursuit. If the fate which screened us was benign, that which gave us the half-glimpse was infinitely the opposite, for to that flash of semi-vision can be traced a full half of the horror which has ever since haunted us. Our exact motive in looking back again was perhaps no more than the immemorial instinct of the pursued to gauge the nature and course of its pursuer, or perhaps it was an automatic attempt to answer a subconscious question raised by one of our senses. In the midst of our flight, with all our faculties centered on the problem of escape, we were in no condition to observe and analyze details, yet even so our latent brain cells must have wondered at the message brought them. Yet even so, our latent brain cells must have wondered at the message brought them by our nostrils. Afterward, we realized what it was, that our retreat from the fetid slime coating on those headless obstructions, and the coincident approach of the pursuing entity, had not brought us the exchange of stenches which logic had called for. In the neighborhood of the prostrate things, that new and lately unexplainable photo had been wholly dominant, but by this time it ought to have been largely given place to the nameless stench associated with those others. This it had not done, for instead the newer and less bearable smell was now virtually undiluted, and growing more and more poisonously insistent each second. So, we glanced back. Simultaneously, it would appear, though no doubt the incipient motion of one prompted the imitation of the other. As we did so, we flashed both torches full strength at the momentarily thinned mist, either from sheer primitive anxiety to see all we could, or in a less primitive but equally unconscious effort to dazzle the entity before we dimmed our light and dodged among the penguins of the labyrinth center ahead. An unhappy act. Not Orpheus himself nor Lot's wife paid much more dearly for a backward glance. And again came that shocking, wide-ranged piping. To Kelly Lee. To Kelly Lee. I might as well be frank, even if I cannot bear to be quite direct, in stating what we saw, though at the time we felt that it was not to be admitted even to each other. The words reaching the reader can never even suggest the awfulness of the sight itself. It crippled our consciousness so completely that I wonder we had the residual sense to dim our torches as planned and to strike the right tunnel toward the dead city. Instinct alone must have carried us through, perhaps better than reason could have done. Though if that was what saved us, we paid a high price. Of reason, we certainly had little left. Danforth was totally unstrung, and the first thing I remember of the rest of the journey was hearing him lightheartedly chant a hysterical formula in which I alone of mankind could have found anything but insane irrelevance. It reverberated in falsetto echoes among the squawks of the penguins, reverberated through the vaultings ahead, and, thank God, through the now empty vaultings behind. Right. He could not have begun it at once, else we would have been alive and blindly racing. He could not have begun it at once, else we would not have been alive and blindly racing. I shudder to think of what a shade of difference in his nervous reactions might have brought. South Station under Washington, under Park Street, South Station under Washington, under Park Street, under Kendall, Central Harvard. The poor fellow was chanting the familiar stations of the Boston-Cambridge Tunnel that burrowed through a peaceful native soil thousands of miles away in New England. Yet to me, the ritual had neither irrelevance nor home feeling. It had only horror, because I knew unerringly the monstrous, nefandous analogy that had suggested it. We had expected, upon looking back, to see a terrible and incredibly moving entity if the mists were thin enough, but of that entity we had formed a clear idea. What we did see, for the mists were indeed all too malignly thinned, was something altogether different and immeasurably more hideous and detestable. It was the utter, objective embodiment of the fantastic novelist's thing that should not be. And its nearest comprehensible analog is a vast, onrushing subway train as one sees it from a station platform, the great black front looming colossally out of infinite subterraneous distance, constellated with strangely colored lights and filling the prodigious burrow as a piston fills a cylinder. But we were not on a station platform. We were on the track ahead as the nightmare plastic column of fetid black iridescence oozed tightly onward through its 15-foot sinus, gaining unholy speed and driving before it a spiral, re-thickening cloud of the pallid abyss vapor. It was a terrible, indescribable thing vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congery of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous and with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light all over the tunnel, filling front that bore down. Have I read all these before? No, this is the first time I've read this. I'll just restart that sentence. But we were not on a station platform. We were on the track ahead as the nightmare plastic column of fetid black iridescence oozed tightly onward through its 15-foot sinus, gathering unholy speed and driving before it a spiral, re-thickening cloud of the pallid abyss vapor. It was a terrible, indescribable thing vaster than any subway train, a shapeless congery of protoplasmic bubbles, faintly self-luminous, and with myriads of temporary eyes forming and unforming as pustules of greenish light all over the tunnel, filling front that bore down upon us, crushing the frantic penguins and slithering over the glistening floor that it and its kinds had swept so evilly free of all litter. Still came that eldritch, mocking cry, "To Kelly Lee! To Kelly Lee!" And at last we remembered the demonic Shuggets, given life, thought, and plastic organ patterns solely by the old ones, and having no language save for that which dot groups expressed, had likewise no voice save the imitated accents of their bygone masters. Chapter 12. Danforth and I have recollections of emerging into the great sculptured hemisphere and of threading our back trail through the cyclopean rooms and corridors of the dead city. Yet these are purely dream fragments involving no memory of volition, details, or physical exertion. It was as if we floated in a nebulous world or dimension without time, causation, or orientation. The gray half-daylight of the vast circular space sobered us somewhat, but we did not go near those cached ledges or look again at poor Gedney and the dog. They have a strange and titanic mausoleum, and I hope the end of this planet will find them still undisturbed. It was while struggling up the colossal spire incline that we first felt the terrible fatigue and short breath which our race through the thin plateau air had produced, but not even the fear of collapse could make us pause before reaching the normal outer realm of sun and sky. There was something vaguely appropriate about our departure from those buried epochs, for as we wound our way panting up the 60-foot cylinder of primal masonry, we glimpsed beside us a continuous procession of heroic sculptures in the dead race's early and undecayed technique. A farewell from the old ones, written 50 million years ago. Finally scrambling out at the top, we found ourselves on a great mound of tumbled blocks, with the carved walls of higher stonework rising westward, and the brooding peaks of the great mountain shewing beyond the more crumbled structures toward the east. The low Antarctic sun of midnight peered redly from the southern. The low Antarctic sun of midnight peered redly from the southern horizon through rifts in the jagged ruins, and the terrible age and deadness of the nightmare city seemed all the starker by contrast with such relatively known and accustomed things as the features of the polar landscape. The sky above was a churning and opalescent mass of tenuous ice vapors, and the cold clutched at our vitals. Wearily resting the outfit bags to which we had instinctively clung throughout our desperate flight, we rebuttoned our heavy garments from the stumbling climb down the mound and the walk through the Wearily resting our outfit bags to which we had instinctively clung throughout our desperate flight, we rebuttoned our heavy garments for the stumbling climb down the mound and the walk through the eon-old stone maze of the foothills where our aeroplane waited. Of what had set us fleeing from the darkness of Earth's secret and archaic gulfs, we said nothing at all. In less than a quarter of an hour, we had found the steep grade to the foothills, the probable ancient terrace, by which we had descended, and could see the dark bulk of our great plain amidst the sparse ruins of the rising slope ahead. Halfway uphill toward our goal, we paused for a momentary breathing spell, and turned to look again upon the fantastic Paleogean tangle of incredible stone shapes below us, once more outlined mystically against an unknown west. As we did so, we saw that the sky beyond had lost its morning haziness, the restless ice vapors having moved up to the zenith, where their morning outline seemed on the point of settling into some bizarre pattern which they feared to make quite definite or conclusive. There now lay revealed on the ultimate white horizon beyond the grotesque city a dim, elfin line of pinnacled violet. There now lay revealed on the ultimate white horizon beyond the grotesque city a dim, elfin line of pinnacled violet whose needle-pointed heights loomed dreamlike against the beckoning rose color of the western sky. Up toward this shimmering rim sloped the ancient tableland, the depressed course of the bygone river traversing it as an irregular ribbon of shadow. For a second we gasped in admiration of the scene's unearthly cosmic beauty, and then vague horror began to creep into our souls. For this far violet line could be nothing else than the terrible mountains of the Forbidden Land, highest of Earth's peaks and focus of Earth's evil, harborers of nameless horrors and arcane secrets, shunned and prayed to by those who feared to carve their meaning, untrodden by any living thing of Earth, but visited by the sinister lightnings and sending strange beams across the plains in the polar night. Beyond doubt, the unknown archetype of that dreaded Kadath in the cold waste beyond abhorrent Leng, whereof unholy primal legends hint evasively. We were the first human beings ever to see them, and I hope to God we may be the last. I'm going to reread that paragraph because I kind of botched that. There now lay revealed on the ultimate white horizon beyond the grotesque city a dim, elfin line of pinnacled violet whose needle-pointed heights loomed dreamlike against the beckoning rose color of the western sky. Up toward this shimmering rim sloped the ancient tableland, the depressed course of a bygone river traversing it as an irregular ribbon of shadow. For a second we gasped in admiration at the scene's unearthly cosmic beauty, and then vague horror began to creep into our souls. For this foul violet line could be nothing else than the terrible mountains of the Forbidden Land, highest of Earth's peaks and focus of Earth's evil, harborers of nameless horrors and archaean secrets, shunned and prayed to by those who feared to carve their meaning, untrodden by any living thing of Earth, but visited by the sinister lightnings and sending strange beams across the plains in the polar night. Beyond doubt, the unknown archetype of that dreaded Cadath in the cold waste beyond abhorrent Lang, whereof unholy primal legends hint evasively. We were the first human beings ever to see them, and I hope to God we may be the last. If the sculptured maps and pictures in that pre-human city had told truly, these cryptic violet mountains could not be less than 300 miles away, yet none the less sharply did their dim elfin essence just above that remote and snowy rim, like the serrated edge of a monstrous alien planet about to rise into unaccustomed heavens. Their height, then, must have been tremendous beyond all known comparison, carrying them up into tenuous atmospheric strata peopled by such gaseous wraiths as rash flyers had barely lived to whisper of after unexplainable falls. Looking at them, I thought nervously of certain sculptured hints of what the great bygone river had washed down into the city from their accursed slopes, and I wonder of how much sense and how much folly had lain in the fears of those old ones who carved them so reticently. I recalled how their northerly end must have come near the coast of Queen Mary Land, where even at that moment Sir Douglas Mawson's expedition was doubtless working less than 1,000 miles away, and hoped that no evil fate would give Sir Douglas and his men a glimpse of what might lie beyond the protecting coastal range. Such thoughts formed a measure of my overwrought condition at the time, and Danforth seemed to be even worse. Hey, annoying goose. Yet long before we passed the great star-shaped ruin and reached our plane of fears had become transferred to the lesser but vast enough range whose recrossing laid ahead of us. For these foothills, the black, ruin-crusted slopes reared starkly and hideously against the east, again reminding us of those strange Asian paintings of Nicholas Roerich, and when we thought of those damnable honeycombs inside of them, and all of the frightful amorphous entities that might have pushed their fetidly squirming way even to the topmost hollow pinnacles, we could not face without panic the prospect of again sailing by those suggestive skyward cave mouths where the wind made sounds like an evil musical piping over a wide range. To make matters worse, we saw distinct traces of local mist around several of the summits, as poor Lake must have done when he had made that early mistake about volcanism, and though shiveringly of that kindred mist from which we had just escaped, of that, and of the blasphemous horror-fostering abyss whence all such vapors came. This is the last mech boss, yeah. No, I think Plantera won't be bad at all. Probably easier than the mechs. Phase 2 Plantera's got shit defense, Phase 1 Plantera is really easy to face tank and deal damage to, and Plantera does not have very much HP at all. She's got like as much HP as Skeletron Prime, but less defense, and also is much easier to hit. I don't suspect Plantera will give me much trouble. All was well within the plane, and we clumsily hauled on our heavy flying foes. Danforth got the engine started without trouble, and we made a very smooth takeoff over the Nightmare City. Below us, the primal Cyclopean masonry spread out as it had done when we had first saw it, so short yet infinitely long a time ago, and we began rising and turning to test the wind for our crossing through the pass. At a very high level, there must have been great disturbance, since the ice dust clouds of the zenith were doing all sorts of fantastic things, but at 24,000 feet, the height we needed for the pass, we found navigation quite practicable. As we drew close to the jutting peaks, the wind's strange piping again became manifest, and I could see Danforth's hands trembling at the controls. Rank amateur though I was, I thought at that moment that I might be a better navigator than he in effecting the dangerous crossing between pinnacles, and when I made motions to change seats and take over his duties, he did not protest. I tried to keep all my skill and self-possession about me, and stared at the sector of reddish farther sky betwixt the walls of the pass, resolutely refusing to pay attention to the pulls of mountaintop vapor, and wishing that I had wax-stopped ears like Ulysses' men off the Siren's coast to keep that disturbing wind piping from my consciousness. But Danforth, released from his piloting and keyed up to a dangerous nervous pitch, could not keep quiet. I felt him turning and wriggling about as he looked back at the terrible receding city, ahead at the cave-riddled, cube-barnacled peaks, sideways at the black sea of snowy, rampart-strewn foothills, and upward at the seething, grotesquely clouded sky. It was then, just as I was trying to steer safely through the pass, that his mad shrieking brought us so close to disaster by shattering my tight hold on myself and causing me to fumble helplessly with the controls for a moment. A second afterward, my resolution triumphed and we made the crossing safely, yet I am afraid that Danforth will never be the same again. I have said that Danforth refused to tell me what final horror made him scream out so insanely, a horror which, I feel sadly sure, is mainly responsible for his present breakdown. We had snatches of shouted conversation above the wind's piping and the engine's buzzing as we reached the safe side of the range and swooped down below the camp. Jesus Christ. We had snatches of shouted conversation above the wind's piping and the engine's buzzing as we reached the safe side of the range and swooped slowly down toward the camp, but that had mostly to do with the pledges of secrecy we had made as we prepared to leave the Nightmare City. Certain things we had agreed were not for people to know and discuss lightly, and I would not speak of them now but for the need of heading off that Starkweather Moor expedition, and others. Certain things we had agreed were not for people to know and discuss lightly, and I would not speak of them now but for the need of heading off that Starkweather Moor expedition, and others at any cost. It is absolutely necessary for the peace and safety of mankind that some of Earth's dark, dead corners and unplumbed depths be left alone, lest sleeping abnormalities wake to resurgent life and blasphemously surviving nightmares squirm and splash out of their black layers to newer and wider conquests. All that Danforth has ever hinted is that the final horror was a mirage. It was not, he declares, anything connected with the cubes and caves of those echoing, vaporous, wormily honeycombed mountains of madness which we crossed, but a single fantastic demonic glimpse, among the churning zenith clouds, of what lay back of those other violet westward mountains which the old ones had shunned and feared. It is very probable that the thing was a sheer delusion born of the previous stresses we had passed through, and of the actual, though unrecognized mirage of the dead transmontane city experienced near Lake's camp the day before, but it was so real to Danforth that he suffers from it still. He has, on rare occasions, whispered disjointed and irresponsible things about the Black Pit, the Carven Rim, the Proto-Shuggets, the windowless solids with 5 dimensions, the nameless cylinder, the Elder Pharos, Yog-Sothoth, the primal white jelly, the color out of space, the wings, the eyes in the darkness, the moon ladder, the original, the eternal, the undying, and other bizarre conceptions. But when he is fully himself, he repudiates all this and attributes it to his curious and macabre readings of earlier years. Danforth, indeed, is known to be among the few who ever dared to go completely through that worm-riddled copy of the Necronomicon kept under lock and key in the college library. The higher sky, as we crossed the range, was surely vaporous and disturbed enough, and although I did not see the zenith, I can well imagine that its swirls of ice dust must have taken strange forms. Imagination, knowing how vividly distant scenes can sometimes be refracted, and magnified by such layers of restless clouds, might easily have supplied the rest. And of course Danforth did not hint at any of those specific horrors till after his memory had had a chance to draw on his bygone reading. He could never have seen so much in one instantaneous glance. At the time his shrieks were confined to the repetition of a single mad word, of all too obvious source. To Kelly Lee. To Kelly Lee. That is the end of the Mountains of Madness. To give you a story recap, for those of you that missed part of it, or had difficulty understanding the interesting manner in which Lovecraft writes, an expedition of various scientists, archaeologists, and similar peoples had ventured from Miskatonic University, university in Massachusetts, to the Antarctic in search of information about what life in the Antarctic had been like in the distant past. They had a new drilling apparatus designed by a professor there by the name of Peabody, which was able to penetrate the crust and ice in a way that previous tools were incapable of doing. As a result, they discovered things. As a result, they discovered many things which they would have been better off not knowing. The initial expeditionary crew, at the hands of Lake, had ventured off the path they had initially decided to investigate, after uncovering a strange artifact in the rock, a green soapstone and a 5-pointed star. They went off to the west and discovered and transmitted this information through the use of radio signals back to Danforth, Peabody, and the rest of the expedition. A vast subterranean world at the foot of unbelievably beautiful and immense mountains. Within that subterranean world, they found specimens of life impossibly ancient, life that destroys all their preconceived notions of how life on Earth had developed, because it was incredibly complex and seemingly intelligent, with very specific evolutionary advancements, millions and millions and millions of years ago, at a time when humanity was nothing more than single-celled organisms amidst a primordial sea. They took out the specimens they had uncovered for dissection, assuming them dead. This was a grave mistake on their part, as they had not merely been dead, but dormant, sitting beneath the ice for hundreds of thousands of years. Amidst an Antarctic storm, the entire expeditionary crew of Lake had been completely killed. Their transmission ceased, and the rest of the party went out to investigate what happened. They found the humans and dogs alike massacred, slaughtered, systematically torn apart, and seemingly investigated with intelligent purpose. And then, noting the disappearance of the specimens that Lake had reported finding, decided to investigate further by aerial survey in the search of one member whose body was not found, Gedney, and the single dog. They flew out above the Mountains of Madness and found an impossibly large city there, millions of years old, far predating the rise of humanity or any intelligent life as they had known it. Within that city, they found an immense number of murals and artistic depictions, which allowed them to glean the history of the race of people that had created this city and what fate befell them. Described repeatedly as the Old Ones, these people were eldritch beings who came from beyond the stars, interstellar travelers who colonized Earth and created all of the life on Earth as they knew it to be then. They had a secret to the creation of life and created life for various purposes, either for the sake of hunting for a food supply, as slaves, as the Shuggoths were made, but over time, not all of life was completely under their control. They spoke of eradicating a race of simian-like creatures who grew to be too dangerous to be left unchecked and presented a threat to the Old Ones. A species uncomfortably similar to the visage of humanity. And following this, as they discovered more and more of the history, they realized that the city had been abandoned about 500,000 years ago, at the coming of the freezing of the Antarctic. In the wake of that, the Old Ones living there were forced to move underground, and this was after they had lived there for millions and millions of years, fought wars with the Migo, the spawn of Cthulhu, and similar otherworldly creatures having come to Earth to protect their land, and colonized many cities beneath the sea as well. This being the initial landing port they had come to, it had carried great religious significance and cultural importance to them, they believed, based on their murals, and so, as a result, many of those living within the city, rather than flee and seek shelter beneath the cities of the ocean, decided to seek refuge within a new city created within the Mountains of Madness, deep below the surface. A lightless Stygian sea. Kept warm by Earth's internal heating. However, yeah, the Stygian depths. This sea was never seen by the narrator and Danforth. Instead, on their way to find the way down, they discovered that the beings that Lake had unearthed and attempted to dissect were also on their way returning to the city. They found the city in disrepair and ruin, and much like Danforth and the narrator had, also uncovered the fate of those living there through the use of the murals. Those other beings, the old ones, learned of the new city underground and sought it out. Following in their wake, Danforth and the narrators discovered the frozen remains of the one dog in Gedney who had been taken from the camp, along with various other supplies and tools that had been taken, presumably for further investigation. And they found the passageway into the Stygian Sea and Second City. Upon following it, they found albino penguins, 6 feet tall, massive creatures presumably having survived from primordial Earth. And, as they got further and further inside, they were assailed by a horrific scent, in contrast to the scent exuded by the Old Ones, and found 4 of the Old Ones, 8 of them having come from Lake's camp, beheaded and in a state of brutal decapitation. And it was unmistakable to them that this occurred at the hands of a Shoggoth. The Shoggoth were creatures created by the Old Ones in ancient times as a slave race. They were formless beings capable of molding their shape and senses to any will required, and originally controlled telepathically through hypnotic, or not telepathically, but through hypnotic commands. They eventually were given vocalization and the Old Ones had had issues with rebelling Shoggoths before, but had quelled that rebellion. The exact nature of the deaths put down there is left uncertain, but what I took it to mean is the Shoggoths that the Old Ones had taken into that city had successfully rebelled against them, and were now operating as a facsimile of the Old Ones themselves. Or perhaps facsimile is too strong of a word, as they're not quite perfect, but imperfect clones of the Old Ones themselves, taking on their patterns of speech, their artistic desires, as the carvings and murals upon the walls later in and near the city were vastly inferior to the ones created by the Old Ones on the surface. And it was this Shoggoth that pursued and chased Danforth and the narrator out of the city. And it was at this point that Danforth and the narrator realized internally that the Old Ones were not themselves evil. They bore no malicious intent. In fact, their actions make completely reasonable sense, and it's actions that virtually any intelligent creature would take in those circumstances. They've been taken, captured essentially, and are being attacked by instruments, cut open and dissected, defending themselves, particularly after having begun to defend themselves and being attacked further by wild by quadruped beasts, killing all of those they found to protect themselves, and then returning to their home, finding it in disrepair, and then seeking out the rest of their kind. There was no malice in their actions. In fact, the narrator thought them to be very similar to humans, and that it may even be possible to survive an encounter with them and simply be captured by failing to present a threat to them. Then, on their way back, flying over the Mountains of Madness once more, Danforth saw something amidst the highest peaks, the peaks that the Old Ones themselves seemed to be spiritually afraid of, things that they did not depict within their mural carvings, save for its unmentioned presence. Some formless entity which inspired within them fear. Now, the narrator does not go into specific detail about what this is because Danforth did not relay this to him, but Danforth referred to it himself as terms such as the Proto-Shoggoth, Yog-Sothoth, and various other things that imply some formless, horrific entity residing within the Mountains of Madness. And the narrator wrote this story with the intention of discouraging further expeditions to that Antarctic wasteland, as rousing whatever lay within out of its Antarctic depths and bringing it back to temperate climates may be disastrous and catastrophic for the human race as a whole. And that was at the Mountains of Madness. That was the gist of the story. I feel like as a review of it, it was, I don't know, how well could you guys actually understand what was going on? Because of the way the story was set up, that's not possible, AT-217. They did not realize what was truly there until it was too late to prevent that information. They were radioing back the information as they were uncovering things. You kind of understood it, weird writing. Yeah, Lovecraft's writing is very difficult to listen in audio form, I imagine, and post what's happening. It is not an easy read. And while there is a lot of, like, it was interesting to me. I was interested in the story and what was going on. But, like, it was the flow of the sentences in particular and a couple of archaic words that were being used that really threw me off. In certain parts, we had trouble figuring out the bigger picture of what was going on. Yeah, especially because he went into an ungodly amount of detail describing menial, technical things, like the exact dimensions of rooms. There were like 2 or 3 pages devoted just to describing the sensory or the appendages and features of the Old Ones. There was a lot of, like, just reading through stuff like that. Things that are not plot relevant but are intended to give, I think, a gradual sense of dread. I do think the book... The first half of the book was filled with a lot of nothing. It was a lot of build-up and a lot of trying to give you a sense of something being wrong, but it didn't really capitalize on that until rather late in the book. So it felt like a lot of just, like, yeah, these guys are... I'm reading a scientific report on what happened to these guys when they went to the Antarctic for like 30 pages. He came about making an entertaining and non-boring story. He just wants to convey certain themes and invoke emotion faithfully. Yeah. And, like, I think the intention though was to give it verisimilitude, to make it seem as if this was an actual report that was coming out of actual scientific, professors at this university, um, to make it feel more real, to make it feel like something that could have happened. And as a result, anything like this would go into a bunch of detail describing things. But God, I am not interested in the geologic significance of the different types of rocks that you found at different places. Holy shit, the amount of times that he talked about like the geologic strata and the Precambrian slate and shit like that. Like, I'm not a geologist, man. I don't. Why go into that? Because the research thing was intended to be a geologic survey. The narrator is a geologist in the story, and that is how he is determining the time periods in which things are happening. Like, this rock sample correlates to this period of time, so we know this is 700,000 years ago, 2 million years ago, stuff like that. Yeah, I'm not reading another story today. That's not happening. We already lost a decent amount of time because I had to keep looking away and I couldn't keep hitting Retinazer effectively. Hey, Jokey. And it... I don't feel like I would read that story again. Like, it was an enjoyable read, don't get me wrong. But, like, that was just so much to read. I certainly would not read it out loud. Maybe I would comb through it by myself, like, reading it in bed or something, but reading Lovecraft out loud is really, taxing. Will Plant take 2 streams? I don't know. Probably. But we'll see. I mean, I would potentially be interested in reading some of Lovecraft's other stories during some of the other fights. But not today. Not today. At this point, I'm just going to focus on DPSing Retinazer. I don't have too many ideas for what to do, because I don't... The problem with playing a video at the same time is it seemed to cause my stream to drop out sometimes. I don't know why that was. I can't do anything that requires looking away from the screen for a period of time, unfortunately. I should change the music, though. Let's go back to the Rain World soundtrack. Rain World soundtrack. Complete soundtrack. 1 year ago. Maybe this has the threat themes in it. It's been that one Rainworld sound on loop. Yeah. That's the spooky narration music. Holy shit, it's the Rainworld song. Simp trapping horny Terraria players on the Discord server with a maid outfit win? I don't know what that means. We're ticking down though. We've done 7,000 damage. So we're over halfway there. And given the slower rate that we were dealing damage when reading, I feel like we're probably about halfway through the fight. Wait, no. That doesn't make any sense. More than halfway through the fight. Probably like 2/3, 3/4. Because that was 100 damage right there in that brief period of time. We will have to slow down a bit though, because the rate that we're taking damage isn't sustainable. Yeah, I do think, not gonna lie, you know, the Mountains of Madness had better narrative payoff than The Street. Like, I'm not gonna lie, The Street was a lot of nothing. No, there was nothing going on in the street. It was literally just him describing a street. Like, oh, the street's weird, yo. I noticed that 8217, yeah. Kind of felt like, huh, you're not really a big fan of people coming to the street, huh? But it also seemed to have, like, it wasn't entirely xenophobic. Because I think I remember part of it being, like, I don't know if I was just reading into it weirdly, or if it was describing that the people who stayed on the street were, like, describing them in a negative sense, and the people coming in a positive one. At least I thought I remember that at one point. But yeah, it was an interesting story. I do wonder where the inspiration for that came from. Yeah, and then... Wasn't Lovecraft racist? Oh, yeah. But, like, reading the story, there was a point where I was like, this feels xenophobic, and then there was a part of it that I'd read that felt like, that seems not being xenophobic. Now I'm confused. Let me know if the music is too loud, by the way. I love looking at Retinazer on the side there, as he just immediately turns to face me as I teleport. Yeah, I imagine he just has all the soundtracks in order, really. Yeah, he had interesting beliefs. I feel like he had a very sad life. And I feel like had he been raised in different circumstances, I don't think he would have been as racist as he was. I think it was largely because I think he like became less racist later in life, and upgraded to xenophobia. Um, his whole life is just very sad, though. I feel less like angry at him for being racist and more just sad at the environment that produced that racism. Because, like, I don't... Like, his cat is a big thing, but I don't even think he named his cat. Wasn't it, like, his dad's cat or something? Maybe I'm misremembering that. I thought I remembered that being a thing. Why do so many writers have a sad life? Because having a sad life, a lot of writers express their emotions and pain in writing. And that environment leads to people having things to express. It's a creative outlet. Um, yeah, I'll reread the recap at the beginning of this book to refresh myself on some of the parts of Lovecraft's life. I'm not going to read it all out loud, don't get me wrong. But it gave like a recap of the Random Gods climax for 1 hour. I can't climax for 1 hour. Huh? A couple seconds tops. Yeah, Lovecraft, let's see. He was born in 1890, August 20th, in Providence, Rhode Island. His parents were reasonably wealthy, like New England aristocracy type. And his grandfather, in particular, was very rich. However, Lovecraft's father had a severe mental breakdown in 1893. He spent 5 years in a sanitarium and died in 1898 of what was speculated to be syphilis. That would have been when he was 8 years old. And then he was raised by his mothers, his two sisters, and their father. So his grandfather. His grandfather died in 1904, and his family's money basically disappeared. This would have been when he was 14. And then his mother, who he did not have a good relationship with, they had to move to a smaller home. And he suffered a variety of illnesses, many of them psychological, during his teenage years. And he responded to these adolescent stresses by pouring his energies into reading and writing. He was particularly drawn to books on science and antiquarian history, as well as Gothic fiction, and he loved Edgar Allan Poe quite a lot. He had a nervous breakdown in 1908 when he was 18, and this prevented him from receiving his high school diploma. But he researched in a variety of fields outside of high school. He developed an interest in amateur journalism and had several of his own periodicals that he ran. The Scientific Gazette, Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy. In his mid-teens, he began to contribute occasional articles on various scientific topics to the Providence Tribune, the Providence Evening News, and other local newspapers. And then the 5 years after his nervous breakdown, There's not much that's known about it. He presumably kept reading and things. He seemed very lethargic and depressed in his early 20s, late teens, following his nervous breakdown. But then he joined the United Amateur Press Association, which helped get him out of that cycle of lethargy and depression. His talents as a writer and extensive literary and scientific background proved the right mix for a young man now interested in making his mark in the field of journalism. And he became a prominent figure. He made his own magazine. And he started writing fiction again. The Beast in the Cave and The Alchemist. He wrote The Beast in the Cave when he was 15, and he wrote The Alchemist when he was 18. Those are the first... those two books that we read. The short stories. Which, I mean, were kind of mid, not gonna lie. Compared to, like, some of his later works, I think they were a little underwhelming. And then he continued writing fiction. And although he wrote prolifically throughout most of his life, fiction was not his primary mode of expression. He wrote journalism, poetry, essays, and a mountain of correspondence. The sum of which makes his fictional output, some 60 or so shorts and a few short novels, seem quite thin by comparison. But he's mostly reputed for the fiction. He published in a variety of amateur, startup, and professional journals his fiction. Weird Tales was his principal publisher. In 1921, his mother passed away. This would have been when he was 31? 31. After a protracted illness that largely confined her for the last 2 years of her life to the same sanitarium where her husband had spent his final years. And then after she died, Lovecraft met Sonia Haft-Green. They were both journalists, and they began a courtship. She was 7 years older than him and the proprietor of a hat shop in New York, and also wrote stories with supernatural themes. He died fairly young, yeah, time death. But spoilers, we haven't gotten to that part yet. They married in 1924, and Lovecraft moved to New York. Their marriage was not a happy one. He didn't feel at home in New York, and he failed to find satisfactory employment. Compounding the misery, Sonia's shop failed, and she suffered bouts of ill health that required her to spend considerable time away at sanatoriums. Eventually, Sonia moved to Cleveland to pursue new employment, and in 1926, Lovecraft returned to Providence. He wanted Sonia to rejoin him in Providence, but his aunts decided there was no room in the Lovecraft family for a working woman, and Lovecraft was unequal to the task of standing up for them on Sonia's behalf. They divorced in 1929. Lovecraft did not remarry. So it sounds like, according to that, he was pressured by his family into divorcing his wife because they did not approve of the fact that she worked, and they did not want her to rejoin him. Lovecraft's return to Providence initiated his greatest periods as a writer with Weird Tales, beginning with The Call of Cthulhu in 1926. He wrote many of his most notable works in the following years, including his greatest single statement on the significance and meaning of the weird tale, The Study Supernatural Horror in Literature in 1927. He penned The Color Out of Space and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward in 1927, and in 1928 he wrote The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929. In 1930 he wrote The Whisper in Darkness, which followed in 1931 by At the Mountains of Madness, which was not published until 1936, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, which was also published in 1936. The Shadow Out of Time was written in 1934. Also published in 1936. These works, along with several dozen of other lesser-known but strange and imaginative pieces, make up the heart and soul of Lovecraft's weird canon, and they have served as models of the genre for generations since. Despite the quality and originality of his literary output, Lovecraft's work was not commercially published in his lifetime. Only The Shadow over Innsmouth appeared in book form while he was alive, released by a small press in 1936 and not widely distributed. Pretty much all of his stories were complete commercial flops. He basically didn't make any money from writing fiction, I believe. His reputation remained a product of his association with weird tales and other pulps and small magazines. It is fair to say that Lovecraft's popularity today and his rising literary reputation owe much to the work of several of his peers, especially fellow weird fiction writers and aficionados August Derleth and Donald Wandre, who, starting with the collection The Outsider and others, brought Lovecraft's works out of obscurity and preserved them in book form. Unfortunately, the commercial success of Lovecraft's fiction and his subsequent literary fame all came after his untimely passing. During the months leading up to his death, Lovecraft ignored and left untreated the symptoms of intestinal cancer, and when he finally sought help, it was too late. He entered the hospital on March 10th, 1937, and on March 15th, he was dead. Didn't that also happen with Poe? It happened with a lot of artists. I don't remember the specifics of Poe's life, though, but it's a common theme with a lot of writers who they're not really recognized for their work while they're alive, but then due to friends, family members who know their work was really good, popularizing and getting it published elsewhere post-mortem. I think he would have died anyway, of the intestinal cancer. It is the Wah 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 song, yeah. But yeah, so ultimately Lovecraft just had a very sad life. And while that by no means justifies his beliefs, I do find they're probably more... Yeah, no kids either. I feel like his racism and beliefs like that are probably driven out of severe paranoia and fear. Owing to his, like, mental breakdowns and things like that, and psychological issues. As I imagine, Providence, Rhode Island in the early 1900s was not a very racially diverse place, and as a result, I would hazard a guess it was probably more just that he was afraid of a lot of things repeatedly because he was like a recluse and a shut-in, and that probably led to very unpleasant beliefs about racial minorities being demonized. A nice childhood, though. Yeah, most of his issues seem to come in his teens and later life. It seemed like after his grandfather died, and the money cut off from his family, that was when things kind of went very poorly. But it's hard to say, because he's not alive, and the information we have about him is sparse and limited. Mostly writings that he made, and things that other people have said. It would be nice to think that the racism that he believed in was not something inherent to his person, and is more a product of his conditions, environment, and time, and that given taking the same person to a different environment in modern days, he wouldn't hold those same beliefs, but it's also he may have just been racist. It's hard to tell. With historical figures. Yeah, it's... I don't, by any means, it's weird with artists like that, right? Because you draw the line of your show's opinion is also the norm. That looking at things in history is complicated. I don't know that like there were definitely people who held racially progressive ideas. Like, this is only the 1900s. This isn't like you know, 1840s mid-slavery. This is like Jim Crow era. Yeah, but like as is, I don't think we can judge Lovecraft based on hypothetical actions of what might have been had he had different circumstances. I think you kind of just have to accept the fact that, yeah, dude was racist. Dude was not, in possession of very pleasant beliefs, and like you can feel bad for him. You can see those beliefs as being the product of his environment and society, but the fact is he did still hold them. And as a result, I don't think he's the type of author to idolize or put on a pedestal, because, I mean, it's hard to know what kind of person he was, and usually things like that, I would look at the author as a person, and the things we have about Lovecraft or a person are that he had a very sad life, and he was rather racist. But I do think I can respect his works as a telepathy of the old ones is more effective the less white the target is. Well, I will say, I mean, he probably wrote it in one of his stories. I would not be surprised. That sounds like the sort of thing he would write. I don't remember any of the stories that we read on stream having outright racism or references to race. There seemed to be a degree of xenophobia present in the street, but I don't really recall any themes of racism in The Alchemist, At the Mountains of Madness, or The Beast in the Cave. I'm sorry, Molly. It's debatable. Some say it's connected to intelligence. That's about to make it better. Yeah, that's kind of a skull emoji. But Lovecraft was incredibly influential in the scene of like weird and cosmic horror, and especially in modern times, a lot of literature, particularly in video games, manga, short stories, is heavily influenced by Lovecraft's work. Yeah, Terraria has a big Lovecraftian influence too. Hey, Night Boss. Which is weird, because like the foreword of the compilation of stories that said, he didn't actually write that much. Like, have I had a bagel today? I have not. We bought some bagels though when we were at the store earlier. Like, he only has a handful of short stories, and a lot of short stories and a handfuls of novels. Like, he did a lot with not very much, in terms of his influence. And like, his writing is compelling. Bagels are low tier, get the fuck out of here. Like, At the Mountains of Madness was an enjoyable read. I feel like some aspects of it have certainly dulled in the time since they were written. Like, the idea of Eldritch Horror is not new at this point. Like, these cosmic things, you're expecting them. You know where the story's going to be heading in a large part. But that also gives you a creeping sense of dread, which enhances the story. Um, you're familiar with Lovecraftian themes, and you know the general, you know, types of things you're going to be hearing about in the story. But like, I feel like at the Mountains of Madness, having the element of building up the old ones as some evil, malicious entity, and then subverting that with they were basically just intelligent people, very similar to men, that had done what they would have done in that situation, humanizing them. Is a nice subversion over just, oh, the spooky monster was something they saw and it was scary. He did have a tendency to drag on a bit, but it was also trying to instill that sense. I do need to read some of his later short stories, because the two that we read on stream were, like, the ones he wrote when he was, like, quite young. Some of his earlier works, and, I feel like probably developed more as a writer after that, and made more compelling stories. Do I read philosophy? No, not really. Modern horror films suck for that exact reason. They've forgotten that dread is more scary than panic. I mean, video games do that a lot, too. A lot of the most popular horror video games are not atmospheric horror, they're jump scare horror. Which I don't like. Atmospheric horror is great. And, like, I wasn't scared reading that story because, like, you know, I feel like reading a book, it's hard to, you know, feel panic or fear. But there was certainly a sense of, like, discomfort at what you're reading, of like, oh, this shouldn't be like this. I feel like it would be, it's a lot easier to represent in visual mediums than written ones. The awkward nature of how I'm doing it also probably dulled the emotional impact of the story, because reading it over several days, looking up and down every couple seconds. Yeah, the other thing is, a lot of people who are not familiar with Lovecraft's writings misunderstand what his stories were about, I feel like, in the large part. Like, a lot of them are stories of people revolving around strange, usually not, try audiobooks. I mean, I don't really have the patience for audiobooks. Like, I don't read that much to begin with. I have other things I would rather do with my time. I would rather, like, make things, or work on other stuff. Like, reading's not high on my list of activities to do. Okay, we are very closely done with Retinazer, though. I think probably by the end of the hour, we'll be done with them. This truly is a bioengineering. Like the quote about waking up and feeling that everything has been replaced with an exact replica. Yeah, I can also see where in Lovecraft's personal life the themes of, like, mental illness insanity and stuff like that came in, given that essentially both of his parents were committed to and died in an insane asylum, in a sanitarium. And he himself also, I think, spent a good amount of time in a sanitarium, and his wife also had frequent mental issues and went to a sanitarium. Which, I don't know, maybe it's what it was like in the early 1900s, I don't remember exactly, but... The only thing that modern horror movies sucks is that you're older and not scared anymore and you seek to rationalize it somehow. No, I don't agree with that statement. I think I would agree with the statement that you have rose-tinted glasses looking on older horror movies and that there was a lot of trash that was made that you either didn't watch or forgot about. But I do think a lot of modern horror movies rely way too much on jump scares. And, like, that's not a good element for a horror movie. I don't find that entertaining to watch, nor is that good cinema, in my opinion. But gradual feelings of fear and dread, those make much more enjoyable watching experiences. Like, being afraid, being in fear, is not what makes a good horror film. Like, a good horror film is a good film that incorporates feeling of dread and a discomfort within you, and instills those emotions, but at its core is still a good film. Whereas I feel like a lot of them are just, like, trying to make you as scared as possible, particularly with things that are essentially cheap tricks to make you afraid. Like, oh, here's something scary on screen for, like, that has no indication of it being about to appear, just to jump scare you. Now, granted, I don't watch movies very often at all. I particularly hate jump scares because I don't like loud noises. And they're usually accompanied with loud noises. Also, I'm going to be gone Thursday, Friday, and Saturday next week. So I'll probably start Plantera on Monday and hope to have her done. She certainly won't take more than 3 days, I don't think. But I don't want to start her later in the week. Okay, we almost broke 2K. Right. Okay, no. I wasn't sure if I had my Brand of Confusion or Sharptooth Necklace equipped. So... After this, do we get any upgrades before Plantera? I can't think of any. Post-plant really doesn't unlock that much. Post-mix. I feel like we're pretty much as strong as we're gonna get now, unless Chlorophyte armor has stronger. I don't think Chlorophyte's better than Frost chest or leggings, defense-wise. I can't think of anything. I might go for the Pouty Gold to get bacon, though. Get another point of defense. Look at how much, damage Plantera does on Expert. Yeah, Plantera only has 10 defense in her second phase. We're gonna do more than 1 damage in her second phase. First phase, though, no, we're not only gonna do 1 damage. Yeah, Plantera does... Jump scare is just a technique, and only it's possible to gauge which area uses it the most. I'm sure you could gauge which area uses it the most. Plantera does 100 melee damage. Which... We'd take about 10 damage a hit from Plantera, which I don't think is fully AFK-able in her first phase. Unfortunately. Unless I can eke out another, like, 10 points of defense or something. Second phase, she hits a lot harder. We'll have to be a bit more evasive there. I think the easy way to assess how frequently it happened is take a sample of several films. Probably if you just looked at popular films from an era, and then assessed how frequently that technique was used in the film, and compared the number of times it happened, you could pretty easily assess which one used it the most with reasonable confidence. Like, yeah, there's some variation for individual movies, but you collect data, you compare them. Hey, stupid sockhead. Playing a lot of Calamity recently. It's difficult but real fun. Nice. What part are you on? Totally not my end. I don't really care that much. I'm gonna be perfectly honest. Like, I don't care that much about dragging on a conversation about jump scares because I don't care that much about modern cinema. It was mostly the other person in chat that cared about it, who brought it up, I think. I was more continuing on the conversation, but I don't have that much interest in carrying on that conversation. Profane Guardians? Nice. I remember not liking Profane Guardians that much. Especially because at this point, like, I don't have any ability to look up information regarding this. So it's not like I can carry on much of a conversation about it. I'm relying on things that I don't remember that well because I haven't I don't engage with horror movies that often. There's not very much fruit for conversation that's going to come from though. The rework is a lot more interesting than the old one. What happened? What did they change? I assume this is a rework after I'd played. You showing something? Is your volume way up for my stream? Oh, whoops. Sorry. You get a whole bunch of new attacks, and it's not just a constant spear spam all the time forever. Okay, 1400. With 3.5 hours into stream starting, you're very close. Yes, we have been dealing damage quite efficiently to Retinazer. It's still pretty bland. I remember not liking Profane Guardians at all before it was reworked. If it's, like, more enjoyable, then I think that's a good thing. Has it gotten reworked more than once? I don't know. I don't really keep up with, Calamity very much. Providence is just way better. Yeah, Providence is a really nice boss fight, Calamity. At least one. Maybe we should see who's used to the old Profane Guardians, but after the recent rework, they feel harder than Providence. Well, I feel like with a Bullet Hell boss, once you learn the Bullet Hell boss's attacks and how to dodge them, they're not that difficult. And there might be an element of that where you're used to Providence. And as a result, she feels easier just because you know how to dodge and attack her. That means to get rid of all the worm bosses. I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't think... Like, it has a lot of worm bosses, but I don't think it needs to get rid of them or they're all particularly problematic. Like, I think... I don't have much issue with Desert Scourge, Aquatic Scourge. You have... I feel like Stormweaver isn't really that much of a worm boss. As it plays very differently, it just happens to be formatted like a worm. I don't like Devourer of Gods, but that's also one of the mod's iconic bosses, so I feel like it wouldn't be, need to be reworked that much. Or sorry, need to be removed, because I feel like it's kind of just like one of the mod's big bosses, and making it not a worm would be weird. I like Astrodeus. Clicker Heroes is the perfect game to play while one of these running. I don't know what Clicker Heroes is. Never heard of it. Idle game? You know, some indie games are an allegory to some real-life illness. Calamity is an allegory to tapeworms. I like Plague Bringer Goliath a lot, yeah. I like Plague Bringer Goliath's sound design too. The beep boops were nice to listen to. I had fun with Plague Bringer. Does it actually feel like an upgraded Queen Bee? Yeah, but like Queen Bee is a fun boss, so it's a good thing. As opposed to like the old Duke, which I felt like was just more annoying and also easier than Duke Fishron. Or like Ravager, which boss is just really annoying. Old Duke is a bitch. I do not remember having much trouble with Old Duke at all. Maybe it was because I fought Old Duke after you were supposed to in the progress or whatever, but I remember him just being, like, easier than Duke Fishron. I hate Ravager, never fighting him. Ravager's really annoying, yeah. Okay, we're down to triple digits. Does Calamity revamp Duke Fishron a lot? Ravager is really dumb. Yeah, I don't like the scream that it had either. When it, like, summoned it or whatever. Ravager's the easiest final phase of any boss ever. I don't even remember it. This boss music is really annoying. Your wife is struggling. Your Wi-Fi is struggling. No, but we're almost done, Molly. So how long of a twins fight will this have been? 12 hours? How long have we been fighting? 4 hours today. It was like 5 hours yesterday. And that's an audio issue fighting Cryogen. I remember that. The music kept cutting out and I would fight Cryogen. I think that bug was fixed. You can keep the stream open, you just can't see the health. Okay, down to 800. It would have been partially fixed. I don't know. I don't keep up with Calamity. Yeah, we actually... People were very concerned about my ability to deal damage to Retinazer. It's easier to deal damage to Retinazer than it was Spazmatism. But again, that's a good example of people telling me something's impossible, and asking me what my plan for something that they think is like a gotcha, like there's no way you could do this, and then it just ends up being easy, because you just have to like put a couple seconds of thought into it. Like, oh, Retinazer stays above you. How are you going to hit him if you say he stays above you? I don't know, just teleport there? Move above me? Oh, I don't know. Basically what we're doing now. Okay, 645. Figuring out the rapid fire teleport strategy to deal damage faster was big though. That red had Ico for a sec because of that lighting. Yeah, the teleporters make them glow yellow when they're here. Would be nice if he had Ico though, because then we would actually deal damage to him. He would have 0 defense when combined with the Shark Tooth Necklace, and we'd deal 8 damage a hit. And we would have been done with this a long time ago. But unfortunately, the Lawnmower is not a melee weapon and cannot use flasks. After we kill Plantera, it's probably gonna be a while till we go to the next boss, because I'm gonna have to farm out, like, paladin shields and shit. Frozen turtle shell. I think I still might need a third flesh nucky. I don't remember if I got a third one. We need to decide whether we want to try to fight Duke Fishron at the Empress, and I feel like the answer is going to be no, just because how fucking long that would take. Duke Fishron, I think definitely not, because, like, hitting Duke Fishron is so difficult with something like this, because he just does not stay still. Yeah. So I don't think I would do Duke Fishron. And then the Empress of Light. I feel like the Moonlord's gonna be... Like, the Moonlord's gonna take long enough that I don't need to bother with Duke or the Empress, because, like... The Moonlord's gonna take an obscene amount of time. And if we add on Duke and Empress, that's gonna be, like... dozens, if not possibly, like, 100 extra hours. That's really not something I want to spend the time doing. I could probably beat, like, the entire game with a flare gun in the same amount of time it would take me to kill just the Moonlord with a lawnmower. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, Molly, but we'll find out when we get there. $375. No, Empress of Light is piss easy, Charmeleon. She, like, does not deal damage. I don't like the game stuttering there. She's not hard at all. Even for setting up, I still feel like the Empress of Light would be really easy, because she just stays above you, and she only has 1 hitbox. Moonlord has 3 hitboxes. Doesn't Moonlord heal, or is there some bypass thing? You can prevent his healing with a couple different ways. Yeah, 302. Okay, I think we're on his last pixel. Also, as a reminder, we are on expert mode right now. This is expert mode Retinazer. He just doesn't do damage because we got 117 defense. Which is like a lot. Will I stop streaming after I beat him? Yeah. It's late for me. I gotta go eat dinner soon. I will probably turn back on the game audio before we kill him, though. You can hear that lawnmower revving. A lot of cherry boss are tankable? Yeah. I care enough to stop the Blood Moon. I mean, can Race even spawn down here? I mean, find a background walls. Well, actually, no, I wouldn't stop them anyway. I should stop it. Let me, revert my control scheme back to normal. Use item. Left. What's this track called? Oh, I also need to rebind, Right click. This is a threat theme. I forget which threat theme it is. Is this garbage? Yeah, this is garbage waste, isn't it? 77. Yeah, we're just manipulating Retinazer's position. He stays 20 blocks above us. We just have a teleporter 20 blocks above us. And by spamming teleports, he gets confused, and we just stay on top of him. And hit him. And he takes damage. Again, this is the don't dig up seed, which is why we don't have to care about time. 33. Okay, 20. Well, I'm saying that because people are probably going to come to this part of the stream to watch me kill him and not understand what's going on. Spazmatism died a while ago. Okay, he's dead. Let's skip through this blood rune. Okay. You never spam the live button so much. Entire boss about 12 hours? Okay. That was much less time than I was expecting, not gonna lie. Oh, well. Okay, well, that's gonna be it for today. I am hungry. You got money for me? 25 gold. Oh, classy cane. Get in the trash. Beat twins, then die to grow. Okay, let's check out playtime. Ready for dinner? I haven't started. 69 hours, 37 minutes, 12 seconds. Okay, bye everyone.